Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the special U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of April 4th, 2021. I know for many of you, this is Easter weekend, and Easter is a holiday that celebrates longevity. So we are pleased today to have a special panel on a subject that is crucial to the pursuit of longevity, to enabling as many people as possible to get access to life-saving medicines, treatments, and vaccines. Today is our special panel on FDA reform. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. I am co-hosting this panel today with the U.S. Transhumanist Party Director of Scholarship, Dr. Dan Elton, and we have a number of distinguished panelists as well as guests who will contribute their insights to this crucial life-saving series of questions. We have Professor Alex Tabarrok, who is the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics in George Mason University. We have Dr. Max Moore, the President Emeritus of the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, renowned for his work on transhumanist philosophy and the Fractionary Principle. We have Jim O'Neill, the CEO of the SENS Research Foundation. We have Professor Garett Jones from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We have Dr. Edward Hudgins, who is the founder of the Human Achievement Alliance. And we have Willy Chertman, who is a medical student and blogger. He just recently had an excellent summary published on the U.S. Transhumanist Party website of a book on the history of the FDA, which we will hope to get his comments on as well in this panel. And also participating in our panel are several distinguished guests. We have Jose Cordero, our technology advisor and U.S. Transhumanist Party foreign ambassador in Spain. We have Charlie Kam, who is our director of marketing and who was our 2020 U.S. Transhumanist Party presidential candidate. We have Dr. Natasha Vida-Moore, who is the executive director of Humanity Plus. And we have our director of applied innovation, David Shoemaker, our member, Jason Geringer, all of whom have joined us today. So thank you very much. This promises to be a highly insightful and intellectually stimulating discussion. We will start this discussion with a presentation by our very own Director of Scholarship, Dr. Dan Elton, regarding the various ideas for FDA reform that he has been researching over the past several months. So thank you, Dan, and please begin.
Okay. So I hate to take time away from the discussion, but I have a short presentation that is going to run about 20 minutes. So can you guys see this, the slides here?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay. So, sorry, let me pull up the actual slides. Just a sec.
And in the meantime, I will say to our YouTube audience, please feel free to post questions in the YouTube chat. We will be compiling them, and toward the second half of this panel, we will pose them. If you want to ask a question to a particular panelist, please indicate that in the chat, and we will make note of that preference. Thank you. And now, Dan, please proceed.
Okay, so since 1962, for a company to bring a drug to market, they must prove not only safety, but also efficacy using large randomized controlled trials. Trials are very expensive relative to observational trials, and they can take up to 1 to 6 years to complete. It takes another 6 to 18 months for the FDA to review the trial results. The FDA uses excessive precaution. Sometimes they will require another phase 3 trial. And so many companies can't swallow the high cost of these trials. And so many companies stick to variants of what is already known because it's too expensive and risky to invest in new molecules and modalities when the failure rate may be high. So, and there's a glaring inconsistency in the way things are regulated in the US. Many very risky or harmful substances are legal. You can go to a store right now and you can buy tobacco, you can buy vapes, alcohol, marijuana. In some states, you can have hard drugs, and you can even buy big gulp sodas. But doctors cannot prescribe potentially helpful drugs that have passed safety tests and may have science behind them, such as animal models or biomarker studies. Instead, they have to wait 1 to 6 years, and some patients die during that process. And some drugs that may be useful for certain patients in certain situations are never approved at all. So we end up with this thing called the invisible graveyard, which is called the invisible graveyard because the media doesn't report on it. Media reports a lot when an FDA drug has unexpected side effects, but they do not report on the suffering from delays and non-approval of useful drugs, also called type 2 errors. So economists and other researchers estimate the numbers in this invisible graveyard are huge. One estimate puts it at about 100,000 deaths per year. Now, Alex Tabarrok has been blogging very profusely on Marginal Revolution. And he's pointed out that due to the pandemic, the invisible graveyard is invisible no more. For months, US taxpayers have been desperate for vaccines. This is evidenced by very long lines and people traveling hundreds of miles to get these vaccines. Meanwhile, we've had thousands of people dying from COVID-19 every day, and many more suffering from social isolation, loss of loved ones, and job loss. So people are frustrated and they're starting to ask questions. For instance, why was Pfizer's vaccine emergency use authorization pushed from early November to late December? Why are 30 million doses of AstraZeneca's vaccine in warehouses, and why can't the American taxpayer access them? So I could go through all of the mistakes the FDA has made through the pandemic, but that would take hours, and you should probably just read the blog post Alex Tabarrok has written. I'm going to go through a very fast rundown of some FDA reform ideas. I'll try to move as quickly as I can. So the first big idea is improving transparency. Right now, key decisions at the FDA are made behind closed doors. So Congress should mandate a structured report, or one idea is for Congress to mandate a structured report with a cost-benefit analysis on every decision to be published before the decision. The next big reform idea is reciprocity. So this is a fairly simple idea, which is that if a drug or medication is approved by a regulatory agency in a different country, which has equivalent standards, it should be approved automatically by the FDA. Third reform idea is making the agency independent from the executive branch. So this would remove concerns that people have about political meddling from the Health and Human Services Secretary and the President. And I believe that this idea has a lot of support from within the FDA. So theoretically, this should be somewhat easier to achieve. Next reform idea is rolling reviews. Right now, the emergency use authorizations take 4 weeks. We believe that's highly unacceptable. The data could be processed as it is collected. This is just data processing. It's could be highly automated. Approvals, you could use blockchain, for instance. Approvals should not take 6 to 18 months. The next reform idea is adaptive licensing. So this one can be a bit complicated in the details of how you choose to do it, but the basic idea is that while you're doing the phase 3 trial, you can have an interim analysis done and then issue an initial license. And then people can start, doctors can start prescribing the drug earlier. And then those people they prescribe it to would be entered into a database for, and observational data would be collected. A similar idea is free to choose medicine. So in the free to choose medicine idea, after the phase 1 and 2 safety trials, you institute or instantiate a free to choose medicine track, which runs in parallel with the phase 3 trials and allows doctors to prescribe life-saving medications to their at-risk patients. While also the FDA continues and conducts the phase 3 trial. Another idea is called tiered approval. So right now, if you look at like a medicine bottle, it will just say FDA approved to treat X or something. It seems the FDA likes this idea that they tell you what is good or bad, and they just give you this one bit of information. It seems they think that doctors are not smart enough to have more information presented to them. But this is kind of silly because if you look at these nutritional facts that we present to consumers, this is pretty complicated information here. It has pretty technical terms like carbohydrate and riboflavin, but we think it's useful to provide all this information to consumers. So one idea is you can have multiple different types of approval that would be presented on the medicine bottle. So, one approval would be approval for safety. Another approval would be approval for biomarkers. And then you could even have an idea I just had was you could have like a ranking, like this drug is ranked number 3 out of whatever. So then we come to the final big idea, which is really the biggest and most important one, and that is using the Fractionary Principle as a foundation for rational structured cost-benefit analysis. The Fractionary Principle was developed mainly by Dr. Max Moore in collaboration with many other transhumanist thinkers, and then it's been elaborated by Professor Steve Fuller and Professor David Deutsch, among other people. So the Fractionary Principle is a contrast to the Precautionary Principle. Precautionary Principle, in one formulation, it says when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established. So this is just one formulation, but generally these formulations of the Precautionary Principle have some things in common, which is they bias towards minimizing the risks of action without considering the risks of inaction. So the Precautionary Principle is fundamentally irrational due to the asymmetrical focus on what happens with the action, but then ignoring the costs and benefits of inaction. Precautionary Principle is vague. It's anti-progress because progress requires some risk because you're always doing something slightly that's unknown, has some unknowns. It's pessimistic. It just basically says we should give up, just minimize risks, don't do anything new. It's ultra conservative and wasteful. You end up wasting tons of time and money on these safety studies. And it is fundamentally anti-technology. So Fractionary Principle is sort of like the polar opposite on all of these dimensions. So Fractionary Principle is rational. It is not vague. It's if you read the writings of Dr. Max Moore, it focuses on maximizing diversity of values in a structured, quantitative way. It is pro-progress, optimistic, progressive, efficient, and it's actually neutral to technology and nature. It considers both pros and cons of both. So here's a great quote from Professor Brian Kaplan on Max Moore's Fractionary Principle writings. And by the way, he is a fairly well-known economist. He says, underlying Moore's whole discussion is a deep appreciation for the great economic concept of opportunity cost. The progress you don't see because you didn't allow change is as much a cost as the losses you do see because you did. It's only because of some places and times allowed drastic change that we can look back in time to 1000 AD and realize how lucky we are that proaction prevailed over precaution. So now we come to the question of strategy for implementing FDA reform. And here we can think of two broad strategies that can be pursued. In the first strategy, well, first of all, you start with making your arguments as rigorous as possible and making sure your arguments are grounded in good epistemology and ethics. Once you have your arguments very well and carefully formulated, then you distill those arguments into some talking points. So then now there are sort of two paths that can be taken. In the first path, you would meet with patients or patient advocacy groups, give lots of talks, write op-eds, and then you eventually get a mass of very impassioned voters. And then politicians hopefully will respond to the pressure from these voters and make some changes. So that's sort of like the traditional path for achieving legislative changes. But there's another path, which is sort of more of an inside path. And here you go to these so-called influencers within DC, and you go to different think tanks and talk to these different influencers and meet with congressional staffers. And then the insiders will convince politicians to make changes. The changes may just get slipped into a very large bill without the most voters really even realizing. And so these are two different strategies that we can discuss. In a previous Enlightenment Salon event, Aubrey de Grey, who many of you know, suggested that this second path may be more feasible for some of these reforms. But we can discuss this. So some final concluding thoughts are we have many technologies being developed today. Artificial intelligence, genomic medicine, stem cell therapies, anti-aging and rejuvenation, biotechnology, gene therapies, and mRNA vaccines. All very revolutionary technologies that are rapidly progressing that will reduce suffering and save lives. So what we need is actually government to make big investments into regulatory science. This is just my own view here. The universities should teach courses in regulatory science. Government should hire technologists and pay them very high salaries. Another idea is we should test FDA decision makers and leaders for tech knowledge and send those that don't pass the test to early retirement. I also think government should increase funding in clinical trials, and government economists should calculate the value of information of potential trials so that we can target money towards trials which will have the greatest utility. And then finally, I have one final point, which is that this, as far as I can see, has very little to do with libertarianism. This is about saving lives. It's not about ideology. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this quite informative presentation and setting the stage for the ideas we're going to discuss today. And now, without further ado, let us proceed to the panelists and their thoughts about which of these ideas, as well as any other ideas for FDA reform, they consider to have the greatest possibility of a beneficial impact, especially in the near-term future, but also in the longer-term future with regard to, for instance, helping humankind achieve significant life extension, hopefully within our lifetimes, as well as their thoughts on the questions of strategy that you raised, Dan. So let us begin with Professor Alex Tabarrok.
Thanks very much. I thought that was an excellent introduction by Dan. I'm just going to underline a few points. Why does the FDA behave in the way it does? Well, as Dan points out, there are two types of errors that the FDA can make, right? They can approve a bad drug. That's one type of error. Or they can fail to approve or delay a good drug. Now look at the incentives in these two cases. If the FDA approves a bad drug, okay, then people are harmed. They go on Oprah, okay? You know specifically who has been harmed. You know who died, okay? Their families, show up. There'll be congressional hearings. Everyone knows that the FDA has made a mistake. Heads will roll, right? So that is a big incentive for the FDA to be extra precautious, right? Not to approve a bad drug. On the other hand, if the FDA fails to approve a good drug, or they delay a drug, they take longer, they do extra precaution, right? Then people die. People die because people die who would have lived had that drug been available. This is what we call the invisible graveyard, right? It's where people go to die, but you don't know who would have lived had these drugs been available. So they're hard to see. It's a statistical reality. But for someone who is not trained in economics or statistics, you don't see these people because you can't put a name on them. You can't say, oh, it was Joe Smith who died. It's a statistical abstract who died. It's still real, but it's abstract. Okay. So you have these two errors. Now, when they fail to approve a good drug, it's the invisible graveyard. No one sees it. So there are no congressional hearings. Nobody protests at the FDA, rarely. Rarely are there any protests, okay? So the FDA is not harmed. The FDA is not harmed when they fail to approve a good drug. And an easy way to see this, okay? An easy way to see this. If I ask you, what's a type 1 error? When did the FDA approve a bad drug? Everyone in the room will put up their hand, right? Okay, even people who don't know, who are not familiar with this issue. Oh, I know, thalidomide, right? I've been hearing this all my life, okay? Anytime I give a talk on the FDA, thalidomide. What about thalidomide, right? Okay, this is like 60 years ago, okay? And it still comes up, okay? So that was when the FDA approved a bad drug, all right? Or almost approved a bad drug, right? Now, what about, I've asked, well, what about type 2 errors? No one can answer this, right? Okay, so this exactly illustrates my point. That everyone knows about type 1 errors, nobody knows about type 2 errors. Even though every time that the FDA takes a little bit longer, right, even a month longer, okay, to approve a drug which ends up saving lives, that was a type 2 error. They failed to approve a good drug. People died because who would have lived had that drug been approved earlier. And yet you ask people and they can't think about a drug, or name one like that, right? Though it's extremely common. It's extremely common. There's another thing about these type 1 and type 2 errors is that in many ways a type 2 error is worse. Why? Well, when you have a type 1 error, when the FDA approves a bad drug, we learn something. We learn about that. Hopefully we learn sooner rather than later, but we should be monitoring. But people die, people are harmed. We learn that and we change our decision. Okay, we take the drug off the market, or we put a warning label on it, or we say, not for use in this particular population. We learn something when we approve a bad drug, and then we change our behavior. What about when we fail to approve a good drug? Well, we don't learn anything, right? No one knows. Invisible graveyard. Even worse, what about when, because we require so many clinical trials, which as Dan pointed out, are extremely expensive. So we require very long, very expensive clinical trials, okay? So in that case, we actually have drugs which never exist, right? Which would have existed had FDA costs been lower, had the cost of producing these drugs been lower. So these type 2 errors, they're insidious. They're insidious because we don't see the consequences of failing to approve a good drug, because those people who die end up in a invisible graveyard. And even worse, sometimes the drug which we failed to approve, sometimes the good drug which we failed to approve, it doesn't exist because it was never researched and developed in the first place. And that is the really huge loss, right? The drugs which are because it has become so expensive to get a new drug approved, about $1 billion or more to get the average new drug approved. Because reaching those hurdles has become so difficult, there are many drugs today which could have been saving lives, which simply do not exist. Right? Many people have pointed out that if aspirin were, someone tried to bring aspirin to the market today, it probably wouldn't be approved. Right? So the losses, the opportunity costs are very, very hidden. They're very hard for the public to see. So this is a problem which we have. In one way, we shouldn't entirely blame the FDA, because the FDA is following their incentives. This is a problem which the public has, okay, which we as human beings have and have to kind of have to deal with continually. What can we do about this? So, as Dan pointed out, there are some minor reforms which I think might pass and which would be sensible, like reciprocity with other countries. So if Germany approves a drug, like if it's good enough for the Germans, it's good enough for me. Right? Like if I lived in Germany and my physician, approved, said, take this drug. Would I ask, or would you ask your physician, oh, but was this drug approved by the US FDA? Right? The Germans don't ask that. Okay. The FDA likes to say that they are the gold standard. They are the gold standard of drug approvals. And yet no other country sort of thinks this, right? In Germany, the patients in Germany, they don't ask, oh, doctor, this drug that you have prescribed me, was it approved? Does it meet the gold standard of US approval? The Germans don't ask that, right? And as a result, sometimes, not always by any means, but sometimes Europe approves a good drug sooner than is approved in the United States. Sunscreens, for example, are much better in Europe. So we have not approved new sunscreens in the United States for like 40 years. The FDA has been reviewing, it's hard to believe, I know. The FDA has been reviewing sunscreens for 40 years to come up with a new method, a new set of conditions for approving sunscreens. And it's taken them 40 years, they still haven't done it. Okay, so you get much more modern sunscreens in the United States, and true sunbathers, much more modern sunscreens in Europe, and true sunbathers, they order their sunscreen from Europe. So we could make that more formal. And in fact, this is so sensible that we actually do this in some respects. Food safety, the FDA is food and drug approval, right? For food safety, the FDA recognizes that Canada has just as good a food safety standard on average as does the United States. So something which passes food safety in Canada automatically passes in the United States. You don't have to do double. You can ship it over the border, no problems. Okay, and we ought to do the same thing with drugs for Germany and Japan and the EU, the UK, and so forth. Okay. What else can we do? One thing which we did, again, which was pretty sensible, was PDUFA. Okay, what is PDUFA? It's just the a Prescription Drug User Fee Act. This is probably the smartest thing we've done in drug approvals in many, many years. We did this a number of years ago, but basically the pharmaceutical firms pay a special tax, and the tax is earmarked to the FDA reviewers. So we got an opportunity here to have the drug firms were willing to pay that tax, that extra tax, so long as it went to speed up drug approvals. So this is what economists call a Pareto win, a win-win solution, right? The drug firms, the pharmaceutical firms got their drugs approved more quickly, which time is money. That meant a lot. This lowered the time to approval, saved lives, and the FDA was happy because they got to expand their bureaucracy. So that's another thing we could do. Another possibility is to think about the FDA as an approver of approvers. So in Europe, for medical devices, typically the European medical review agencies, they don't review directly. Instead, they farm it out, okay? They farm out the reviews to private companies who review the products, and you have a competitive process. And it may work more quickly and more carefully. We have something similar, in the United States, not for medical devices, but for electrical devices, Underwriters Laboratory, right? So if you turn over your lamp, you'll see the UL seal of approval. And many firms like Walmart and Amazon, they won't carry a product unless, an electrical product, unless it has met the UL standards, the UL seal of approval, Underwriters Laboratory seal of approval. So we could think about doing something like that for the United States. So those are all minor reforms I think we could do. We could talk about then going into more extensive reforms, such as Dan mentioned, rolling approvals, thinking about, and again, this next one seems so obvious that we should be doing it. You wonder why we're not, but there's no formal process whereby if a disease is deadlier, then we ought to approve more quickly with lower standards, okay? I mean, that seems like just like the obvious thing to do. Like if you have pancreatic cancer, right? Then the standards for approving a drug for pancreatic cancer, which often kills within 6 months, the standards for approving a drug for pancreatic cancer ought to be lower because the person has less to lose, right? Than if you're dealing with something for acne, okay? So I know, it was a big deal for me too, but let's just say acne is not quite as big a deal. You'll get over it. Teenagers, you'll get over it. But the standards ought to be higher, right, for an acne drug than it is for a pancreatic cancer drug. And to some extent, the FDA does recognize this because it is sort of obvious, but yet there's no formal way in which this happens. This is all totally informal and it's not supposed to happen. And it's all supposed to be the same standards, but informally it happens. But we could do this with Bayesian techniques, Bayesian statistical techniques, where we look at death rates from the disease in question, and then we adjust something as like the statistical significance level, which we require in order to approve a new drug. So I'll just mention one last point and then turn it over. The last point I think, which would be especially interesting for this panel, and I'm sure many people on the panel know more about it than me, but there is no procedure, there is no set of policies, there's no route to approve a drug for like anti-aging. Okay, you can only have a drug approved in the United States to treat a disease. So if you say, I want to have a drug like metformin or something like that, right, which you think could extend human lifespan, there is no way of bringing that to the FDA. You have to say, I'm going to test for some disease, even though aging kills most of us. Right, Max more excluded perhaps, but and Robin Hansen, my colleague, but aging kills most of us. Okay, but there's no way of researching that. There's no route forward. And if you tell a company, this company wants to investigate and spend money on anti-aging, they're going to ask you, well, how can I get an anti-aging drug approved by the FDA? And right now, there's just no way of doing that. So there's no market for doing that. It's expensive, of course, but there's no route forward. And so that would be another kind of a thing that which we could do to allow anti-aging to be researched and drugs and devices to be discovered. And I'll conclude my comments with that.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex, for that quite thorough and informative discussion. And now we will proceed with Dr. Max Moore.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was great. You haven't nothing much to say, really. You've kind of hit a lot of the really important points, I think. And by the way, blast you, now I've looked at your blog, I'm going to have to read that every day too, as long as in addition to the ones on the Econologue. Yeah, so just to maybe focus on a few of the items, Dan's done a good job there putting together some of the possible moves. I know some people have said, forget about abolishing the FDA. I say, don't forget about it. Let's keep that in mind as a long-term goal, because it really needs to go. We don't need it at all. We just need liability laws. So let's not throw that out. It's not impossible. There are examples of agencies being around for decades and then being abolished. It does happen occasionally. It's not easy. But yeah, in the meantime, let's see what we can do about making it work a little bit better. I think one point to make, we're talking about various things we could do, things we want the FDA to do. We want them to do cost-benefit analysis. We want them to make it easier for drugs that are more deadly. But I think one point we have to keep in the forefront of our minds in these discussions is a point that David Friedman made, I guess way back in the 60s, maybe in his column, and again in his book. He talked about barking cats. He pointed out that expecting the FDA to behave differently than it does is expecting expecting a cat to bark, or vice versa. You can't just say, well, we really want the FDA to do this and we're going to tell them to do it. We have to really put some incentives in place. I want to come back to that in just a minute. I think in addition to that kind of problem, that there's a gap between good ideas and getting them to actually happen in the agency, I think we also have to recognize we're facing an enormous cultural barrier in the United States and in many European countries to reforming the FDA and the CDC. And by the way, I'm about to complete a post on the CDC today, which is very complementary to this discussion. In fact, they sometimes work hand in hand, as with preventing people from importing masks, where the CDC says, well, you have to go to the FDA, and no, we're not letting these masks in. You have to go through a long approval process. So it can be an unholy alliance between the two. So there's a huge barrier. Whenever I talk about technological advances and especially reform of the FDA, people get very scared very quickly, and they're always rushing to the thalidomide example, I know, forgetting that actually has a lot of good uses that weren't allowed to be used because it was a blanket ban. So it really is a problem. We don't have a very fractionary culture anymore. We have a lot of fear-based culture, and that's not anything there's a simple solution to. But of course, we can't let that give us up. We've got to really push here. And I think we do have a very good opportunity right now, just as the AIDS activists had an opportunity to push and did make some difference, at least for certain drugs. I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to make some progress in this area. Obviously, among the things that Dan listed, obviously I'm partial to the Fractionary Principle, which is not really a single principle in a way. It's kind of a grab bag of tools based on a certain value perspective that says that progress is basically good, that you can't be omniscient, you have to learn by doing. And as Alex said, you can't really learn things without making mistakes or without trying things. It's kind of a Platonic philosophy that you can sit down, or a rationalist philosophy, like in the old-fashioned sense, that you can sit down and think about everything and decide what the right decision is. When really what you have to do is be a bit more empirical. You have to get out there and do things, try things, experiment. You can look before leaping, but you also got to look while leaping and while landing, and then adjust the way you land, to use kind of a crude metaphor for that. In the Precautionary Principle, there's actually, I was just looking over it today and realizing I've got at least 3 different versions out there. There's one with about 9 or 10 sub-principles, one with 5, one with 7. So I probably need to do a new version that kind of cleans that up and is the official version. But the first one, or the first 2, depending on the version, is to be objective and comprehensive. I think that's, we discussed some aspects of that. Dan mentions in his summary using cost-benefit analysis, for instance, which is a pretty basic thing that has been used in many organizations and not so much in government agencies, it seems. And that shouldn't be very controversial. And that can be done more or less well. Sometimes it's not done that well. That's why I think other principles need to be added to that. But it would be a step towards using more of the ideas in the Fractionary Principle. One of those, for instance, would be one I think that needs to be institutionalized in the FDA and many other organizations is using something like a devil's advocate procedure. Sometimes this takes the form of the red and blue team approach. There's various ways of doing it, but basically it's institutionalizing respectful disagreement. Rather than having people meet behind closed doors and having someone railroad through the most powerful person getting their opinion accepted, it's explicitly allowing people to debate and requiring them to debate. In fact, the devil's advocate doesn't just allow it, it requires it. It makes you, puts you in that position. So it really makes decision makers ponder alternatives. And of course, there are other methods that could be used, things like reference class forecasting, structured argumentation templates, auditing procedures such as review panels. So all of those, I think, are important in addition to cost-benefit analysis. Now, the things that Dan has listed there, I especially like the idea of reciprocity, because that seems like a pretty easy sell. You talk about, if it's good enough for Germany, it's good enough for me. And I think that's true of, I'd say, for the United Kingdom and some other countries too. And that seems like a hard one for the FDA to really argue against, because it's pretty damn arrogant to say, well, only American regulators know what the hell they're doing. So that wouldn't look too good. So that one should be a relatively easy sell, I would think. And obviously it would greatly reduce costs without really increasing any dangers. The expansion of right to try, of course, I agree with very much. As a transhumanist who has promoted the idea of morphological freedom, that sort of fits into that. You should have, obviously, informed consent, and there's still liability laws out there, but you should have the right to try things. And of course, the rolling approvals, another excellent idea. I don't need to repeat what others have said. I think one of the points I want to make, having mentioned that we're dealing with the barking cats issue, and we have these cultural barriers to reform, I think one area we need to really focus on, apart from specific ideas for getting the FDA to be better, is how do we make them follow those ideas? We need to change incentives somehow. It's hard to change their incentives, so we need to create other incentives around them. Obviously, passing a law can help, but laws can be enforced or not enforced, or enforced at various degrees. So how are we going to put bite in laws that require the FDA to do, say, a cost-benefit analysis, or to lower standards for illnesses that are extremely dangerous? That's something I've only begun to think about, really, and would love to have input on. But I think something like an annual audit of FDA decision processes would be good, where the results must be published publicly. It's a requirement by law that these be published, and where the auditors have to include people from a range of organizations. Now, I'm not sure how you'd specify this, but you'd want to have something like maybe the AEIR, and then Brookings Institution from the sort of more liberal side, a variety. So you can't say that any one person is dominating, but it means that different perspectives really get to examine the processes, and it gets published. It's like companies publish annual reports. This would be an annual audit. Businesses get audits of their finances. This would be an audit of decision processes. So in conclusion, without going into the detail of those specifics, I think this is something to really focus on. How do we make the FDA actually follow all these great ideas that we have? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Max, for those excellent remarks. And incidentally, the U.S. Transhumanist Party agrees that abolishing the FDA is not out of the question. In our platform, section 118 states that given the extreme delays, bottlenecks, and expenses created by the mandatory approval processes of the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Transhumanist Party supports abolishing the FDA and replacing it with a radical life extension administration whose mandate would be to prioritize the rapid development of potential cures, treatments, and vaccines, including any possible cures or vaccines for COVID-19, as well as treatments to mitigate and reverse the disease of biological aging, the major risk factor for COVID-19. The RLEA would allow the marketing and collection of patient data on any potential cure, treatment, or vaccine, which has passed affordable safety testing at a reasonably acceptable threshold. And we enacted that plank in March of last year as one of our proposals for responding to COVID-19. Of course, we have perhaps the luxury as the Transhumanist Party to propose essentially the best case policy. And at the same time, there are many other incremental moves that can be made in that direction without a wholesale abolition of the FDA. But I agree with you completely that that is an option that should be held under consideration, at least for some time in the future when it becomes politically feasible. So thank you for your comments. And now we go to Jim O'Neill.
Thank you. I want to start off by saying some good things about FDA. I've had the pleasure of working with them quite a bit. And in my experience, most of the people at FDA are very smart, and they actually believe in approving things, contrary to what it looks like from the outside. The problem is that incentives matter, and they're a central point of failure. And those are major problems that we can't really ignore. Incentives matter both at the institutional level and at the individual level. So at the institutional level, as some other people have said, when someone has a severe side effect from a drug, the commissioner gets hauled up before several congressional committees and interrogated about it. And when someone dies because something wasn't approved, there's total silence in Washington. So that creates a very perverse incentive. So blame Congress, not FDA, for that incentive being in place. Secondly, there are individual incentives. So every individual who works at FDA responds to some degree to the institutional incentives, which are bad, but also often has personal incentives. A lot of them want to be the whistleblower that finds the next thalidomide and calls a dramatic halt to it. That creates a bias towards safety, but against efficacy. And secondly, a lot of them are thinking about their future careers and their next job at a big pharma company. And that gives them an incentive to do what they think their next employer is going to want while they have the power. So both of those incentives are pretty severe and would affect even the most principled person in ways that they couldn't even detect. Most of the reforms that other people have discussed, I agree with. I want to just start by saying two that I disagree with. So I disagree with Alex that FDA not recognizing aging as a disease is a major problem. I do think that aging is a disease. I do think it's one of the most important things that humans can be working on. But in order for FDA to reasonably measure success of any therapy, there has to be a measurable definition. There have to be metrics and biomarkers. And it's not really FDA's job to do all of the scientific work of developing durable, defensible, easily measured biomarkers for aging. That's the job of the scientific community and the anti-aging community. To some degree, it's the job of NIH. So it's absolutely important work that needs to be done. There are epigenetic clocks. There are other biomarkers for aging or for certain types of aging. And we need a lot more work to go into those. Those can then be validated through FDA's biomarker validation program, but I would not at all blame FDA for that. The work needs to be done by other people. The second thing I would disagree with is Dan's idea of making FDA independent of HHS. I actually think that would make it worse because of the incentive problems that I outlined. If there were no political control over FDA, it would be accountable only to the largest pharma companies, and that would be much worse than it is now. So if you want FDA to take other concerns other than the narrow interests of the largest pharma companies into account, you need some other force affecting them. And for better or for worse, having to report to some degree to a secretary of HHS is a nice balance to that. Now, FDA commissioners have a long history of clashing with secretaries. I saw that happen a lot when I was working for secretaries of HHS in the Bush administration. There were lots of epic clashes between commissioners and secretaries. And overall, I think that's good. That kind of tension allows other factors other than the narrow incentives of FDA to be taken into account to some degree. In terms of the reforms that Dan outlined, the ones that I think are most promising, I like all the ones, by the way, other than independence, but the ones that I think are most promising are the ones that go in the area of what I call progressive approval and what he called tiered approval and adaptive licensing, with reciprocity being sort of a somewhat cruder way of getting that same effect. So contrary to the way that FDA and the media talk, doctors and patients are capable of absorbing and using quantitative information. They're capable of making risk-benefit trade-offs, and they know their own situation better than any regulators in Washington. The more information, the more transparent, the better. And regulators in DC should not be intervening or interfering between the discussions between doctors and patients. So the more we can get them out of the way and focus back on their original mission of safety and purity, the better. So I would absolutely support repealing the Kefauver amendments of 1962 and refocusing FDA on safety and purity and transparency, and leave efficacy to scientists and doctors.
Yes, thank you, Jim, for those remarks, and in particular for pointing out the incentive issues that exist with the FDA, which are not a matter of the dispositions of the individual reviewers. They are systemic problems that will likely persist as long as the organization is structured the way that it is. So now we proceed to Professor Garett Jones for his remarks. I believe you are on mute.
Well, thanks very much. I come at this as a macroeconomist, and so my experience is with the success of one important set of independent agencies, the central banks around the world. And I think that the lessons that we've learned about the merits of central banks' independence, keeping central bankers as far as possible, or at least quite far from the levers of democratic government, the benefits of that seem to be the closest thing economists have seen to a free countries where the central banking system kept quite far from the voters, seem to have lower, more stable inflation, and the real economy seems to be at least as good, maybe better than otherwise. I think that countries with independent central banks would be controlled by the influential private bankers, just as some think that perhaps the FDA would be controlled by pharmacists. But I think in point of fact, we have a lot of evidence that with central banks, that hasn't happened in the rich countries at all. So perhaps that won't be a concern very much, making the FDA quite independent of its democratic overlords. So let me give a little more story here for what I think good FDA reform looks like. An FDA that's as independent of Congress and the president as central banks are, or as our judges are from the rest of government. So judicial independence, central bank independence, these should be our templates for FDA reform, I believe. So what do those two organizations have in common in the US? Well, in the US, one thing that you notice about the Federal Reserve is it's a panel. It's a panel of maybe a dozen people who are making these big decisions. It's not just one person. So don't think in terms of an FDA commissioner. Think of an FDA commissioners. That's the way we run the Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Trade Commission, the FCC, and of course, the Federal Reserve and the Supreme Court of the United States. So there seems to be some kind of magic about having a panel of people making these big decisions. I think it gets just a little bit of the benefits of the law of large numbers in decision making. So that seems to be one benefit. Another thing that these independent agencies have, like the Fed and our judges, that they have long terms. So appointed by one president, but you're probably going to be serving under 2, maybe 3. And that gives decision makers long time horizon, lets them feel quite independent of the people who appointed them, of the bosses who appointed them. And I think that, as I say in my new book, 10% Less Democracy, short terms make short-term thinking. And I saw that as a Senate spur, where senators are really behave a lot differently when they're 2 years out from re-election. They really start pandering to the voters and voting against things like free trade a lot more often. And we see that in the Federal Reserve and in the judiciary, where judges, we saw last year, a whole lot of judges who were appointed by President Trump were perfectly happy to vote against President Trump when it came to the election-related lawsuits. So these ideas of political independence leading to decision-making independence is something that we could value and get a lot of benefit out of in future FDA reform. I tend to think that all these discussions about institutional reform are incredibly, have high marginal product right now, as an economist would say. There's a lot of value in this because Congress moves slowly, but Congress tends to look for big opportunities for reform a couple years after a crisis. The Federal Reserve was actually born in 1913 out of the panic of 1907. So 6 years is how long it took between a huge financial crisis and Congress getting around to making final reforms. That's the kind of time horizon that might be useful to think about here. We saw something similar with after the global financial crisis. It took about 2-3 years before Congress got together its set of reforms. So the ideas that people are discussing now, I think, will they'll be part of the information ecology of the next few years in Washington, D.C. But I do think that this idea of long terms, independence, panels are a good real world path to better decision making. Like any of you, I can offer individual laws or individual rules that I think would make for good reforms. I myself am an unreconstructed Tabarrokian when it comes to FDA reform. So I endorse everything he has ever said on how to reform FDA and health regulation, medical regulation. But what I need is not to speak my rules to the world. What I do want to push is institutional reforms that seem to work in a wide variety of settings. And institutional reforms that seem to work, that give you a lot of benefits and fairly low costs, seem to include long terms, medium-sized panels, and if possible, greater independence of funding. As Alex pointed out, FDA gets maybe half of its funding now from pharma folks. The Federal Reserve gets all of its funding from just seniorage. And having been to quite a few Fed conferences, I know they're not spending it on the wine. So they actually seem to be using that independence fairly prudently by my amateur estimates. So a little more financial independence, a little more legal independence will tend to create a situation where Congress has less influence. It's less of a source of fear for FDA officials. There's a big issue in studies of the executive branch and of federal agencies is how much agencies are responding to Congress. The most extreme version of this is known as congressional dominance theory. I've had a lot of people on social media tell me that the president is in charge of FDA, the president is in charge of CDC. These people have never actually talked to anyone who worked on Capitol Hill. Agencies live in fear of their congressional overlords. They live in fear of the congressional committees that oversee them. They live in fear of the majority leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. I think, and the reason why is in part because they go to get their budgets from them every year or two. But also in part, it's because they know that if they make a mistake, they can be hauled up before Congress and be fired ignominiously by a president. So the job security tenure gives academics a fair amount of freedom to speak their mind. Sometimes academics misuse that freedom. Sometimes they use it to just become dead wood. That's certainly a risk with any kind of independent judiciary or independent health agency. But in practice, when we look at the data, when we roll the tape, we see that independent agencies with long terms have high benefits, low costs. One last thing I want to say here is that it's fun, as others have made the same point before already today, so I'm just going to reiterate it. It's fun to complain about the FDA, but it's wise to complain about Congress.
Yes, thank you, Garett, for those remarks. And it does look like we have a robust spectrum of views on the question of agency independence, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to explore that in a bit more depth later on in the panel. Now we will proceed to Dr. Edward Hudgins for his remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for putting this event on. You say about, I would like to see regulators not in fear of Congress. I would like to see FDA regulators in fear of sick people who want to get safe medications at less cost quicker. That's the kind of fear I would like to see in regulators. And I think the way you do that, and again, some of the reforms that have been mentioned here, I think are quite on the mark. The FDA is part of the problem. It is a government bureaucracy. By the way, I don't like the Fed in particular, so it might not be a best example for me. But I see the FDA and its incentive systems as the problem. As I think Alex or one of the people pointed out, if you have an FDA employee who wants to, be the one to stop the next thalidomide and be the hero and so forth, well, that's the incentive. You see different incentives within a 15,000 person bureaucracy. I think I've told some of you the story that literally a year ago was the last day of February 2020. I was sitting in FDA offices here in Maryland, talking to them about the free to choose medicine approach. This is a prearranged meeting. And I mentioned to them, I said, guys, I'm getting these reports here that your regulations are keeping test kits for this COVID virus off the market. And there's a whole bunch of other complaints I'm seeing here. And it looks like this COVID thing may end up being a big deal. And it looks like you guys are in the way. And of course, now we all know that that's exactly what happened. And again, it wasn't that these were bad people. And again, I've met with them. I know a number of them. It's not that they're bad people as such. It's just that the incentive system is such that they are worried, in fact, about their careers. They're worried about congressional oversight and so forth. I want to point out a couple of important things here. First of all, their regulatory system is a confused mess. It was set up in 1962, and that's when efficacy was put in as part of their mandate. If you take a look over the years of how they've defined efficacy, that's been a big problem. We think of the standard clinical trials, and that's the way you determine 60% of the product work in this case and 80% in the other case and so forth. But for example, one of the most egregious examples of defining efficacy was when they decided that 23andMe could not offer advice on whether someone was prone to breast cancer because they, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but it was essentially women are too stupid. And if in fact they find that it's not the problem that the genetic information they come up with is wrong, it's, well, they'll look at it and they might go out and have a double mastectomy without getting a second opinion. In other words, the advice based on efficacy, women are too stupid to make these decisions themselves. Appalling. And I could quote other things. I'll give you another example here. In I think it was 1990, 89 or 90, they wanted to classify as a medical device, class 3 medical device, in the same category as a heart valve, a urine specimen sample cup. And now the company went to court over that. Unfortunately, the court shot that one down. You say, well, that was 30 years ago, Ed. Well, in April of 2019, they put out a call for comments on how to regulate artificial intelligence as a medical device. And you say, wait a minute, artificial intelligence is a medical device? Well, they have authority over medical devices, and artificial intelligence isn't medication, so I guess it must be a medical device. Now, I understand from Dan that a lot of the people who work on this issue are actually pretty good and are trying to be very helpful, and that's nice to know. But the point is, you see that this is it's the structure of the FDA. I've attended the last 3 annual FDA meetings, and what's interesting is I'm sitting there with a lot of people who have a stake in it, not only FDA folks, but others. And one of the things you find is there's a lot of people there who are consultants, and their whole job, their whole living is basically working with the researchers and the labs to get them through the FDA bureaucracy. So there's a whole industry to do just that. And that's part of the problem as well. Since 1962, the FDA has done a lot of changes. We've heard a few of them, but it's kind of this slapped together thing where they have a fast track for this and another thing for that. And again, it's the fact that it's kind of a mess, and you have to have literally consultants to help you figure out exactly the best way to get through this bureaucracy. That's why I point out a couple of important things. Number one is that I do think reciprocity is a good idea, but free to choose medicine approach is a good idea, especially because what happened in 1992 during the AIDS crisis, something like 50,000 people were dying a year at the top level. I mean, that's as many people as were killed in Vietnam, Americans who were killed in Vietnam. It was a horrible situation. That's where Congress did step in and basically basically put pressure on the FDA to do something about it. And what they did was it created a parallel track. So once a product had been determined to be safe and it was in efficacy tests now, it could be offered on a parallel track where sufferers could access it if the manufacturer chose to give them the medication ahead of certification. And 12,000 people accessed a particular medication for AIDS during the 3 years that it was being tested. So there are 12,000 people who were not in the invisible graveyard, potentially, because of this parallel track. And so one of the things that Madden suggested in his book, and I've written about it as well, and of course, Alex knows very well what Bart does, don't you, Alex? Is that you create a parallel track for basically any kind of drugs treating a serious ailment. Once the drug has passed phase 1 safety trials and at least one phase 2 trial, then a manufacturer can choose to offer it on this parallel track. Here's the key, that data has to be put into a database that's accessible by anyone, obviously privacy protected. That way, number one, researchers are looking at real world data as it comes in. And it's a different way. And you've seen, and if you look at academic publications, you've started to see more discussion of the fact that that gold standard, it's not that it's bad, but there are alternatives, especially with exponential technologies coming in that can be used. So if the data for anyone using a drug on this parallel track is put into that database, then researchers can look at that. My doctor can look at it and say, well, Ed, this one looks promising. You want to give that one a try. And so you're getting real world data. You allow products to fail quicker, so to speak, than you would with the other kinds of so-called gold standard tests. The other point I want to make, and this is very important for exponential technologies, because right now FDA is struggling to figure out how to deal with the fact that, for example, if you treat aging as a treatable condition, that's Aubrey de Grey's, when I asked him about it, that's how he said we should say it's not a curable condition, it's treatable. He likes treatable condition, but however you describe it. With exponential technologies, that kind of approach, I think, would be very beneficial. The other thing I want to add is, as I've done research into what happened with AIDS, it was, in fact, patient groups that literally besieged the FDA building here in Maryland and did have demonstrations, and it can, again, put pressure on the FDA to create this parallel track for AIDS patients. I think that in light of COVID, and in light of the fact that people see that there's something going wrong with the system, we have an opportunity to change the system by focusing on COVID, but also saying, look at all the other things that are not there that could be there. I mentioned in another broadcast that in 2 states, North Carolina and Texas, there have been moves to change what's called right to try. 40 states passed right to try legislation, meaning they said if a patient in this state, if a manufacturer wants to give a product that's still being tested to a patient who's terminally ill, then the FDA, we recognize that right of the patient. And what happened was Congress essentially certified that a couple of years ago. But now what you see in Texas and in North Carolina, and you can do this in other states, is moves to basically broaden right to try and say it's not just for terminally ill patients, but it's for patients with, like my poor mom who I just visited for Easter has Alzheimer's. Well, that's not terminal right now. Mom is suffering from it, but she's going to be around for a while. But it basically expands what can be done under right to try. And so there's another idea that will put pressure on Washington to say, hey, look, the states are moving ahead on this stuff. You can mobilize patients more easily at the local level than if you're trying to do it nationally. So there's another approach that you can use to put pressure and to push these FDA reforms. And I'm here in the DC area with Dan and Alex is over on the other side of the river. And we're working on some ways of reaching out to Congress and with the new Congress right now to do exactly the sort of thing and to push these reforms, especially reciprocity and the free to choose medicine approach.
Thank you, Edward, and you did outline many promising possibilities. Now, our next panelist, as I mentioned at the start of the session, has just published an extensive summary on the U.S. Transhumanist Party website of Daniel P. Carpenter's book, Reputation and Power. And I've linked to Willy Chertman's summary of this book in the YouTube chat. Please read through it. It is a wealth of information on the history of the FDA and how the FDA came to have the sweeping authority that it has now. So without further ado, Willy, welcome, and please proceed with your remarks.
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm enjoying the discussion so far, especially the insider perspective that Jim O'Neill brought up. I do want to just respond a little bit to Max Moore and Edward Hudgins. So you both mentioned the AIDS activist story in like the late 80s and the early 1990s, and I think it's a very interesting story, and it's maybe a little more nuanced than I initially knew before I read that book. So the summary of it is basically that there were no effective medications for AIDS, and when the first drug was undergoing clinical trials, AZT, the FDA was actually, this was in like 1987, I believe, before any legislation was passed, and really before there had been a lot of patient advocacy that was like very militant, like with the famous Rockville protest. The FDA had a very generous, you could say, expanded access program. So the FDA sort of on its own initiative was very, good about letting patients access it before it had been finally approved. And then so that was before the 1992 law, which formalized it. And then there's another interesting wrinkle there, which is, we all know about the very militant groups like ACT UP, which were pressuring the FDA to move faster and faster on approvals. But in the mid 90s, there actually developed a few almost like counter movements against that from the from the AIDS activist community as well. So this one group was called Treatment Action Group, which pressured the FDA to move slower because they believed that at that point, the FDA was approving HIV medication that really didn't have true benefit for patients. So there's like a very interesting story there where I think actually one of them, Greg Gonsalves, he's I think a Yale professor now or something, but he was key in that effort to push back against, very fast approvals. And so there's like an interesting little history there. But, I'll just start off by saying that my view on the FDA is maybe a little more generous or distinct from most of the panelists here. So I start from the premise that I think the FDA decisions are on average pretty good, though their process has of course been disastrously slow in COVID times, and that attempts to sharply lower drug approval standards have had substantial negative consequences in the past. So a very good book on this is a book called Malignant by Vinay Prasad, which documents that over the last 20, 25 years or so, the FDA has continually lowered the bar for cancer drugs. And the result is that a lot of cancer drugs come out and they're often approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints or biomarkers. And many of them, they don't actually go through the proper follow-up studies to show that they have real clinical benefit. And so there's a lot of issues there where I think we sort of try this natural experiment of lowering standards for cancer drugs, and it seems to not have worked super well. Admittedly, I'm not an economist, I'm not a health policy expert, so maybe there's some quantitative model by which, you kind of pay the cost of some marginal cancer drugs and you get, much more innovation down the line. But I think it's an interesting counter to the desire to lower standards there. And just getting to specific stuff. So I was thinking of the specific failures that happened with the FDA in the case of COVID. So I think the big one was the early failures on testing, which was really a CDC and FDA problem. The lack of transparency on the AstraZeneca vaccine and why it hasn't been approved yet. The decision in October and November that Dan Elton wrote about to delay the interim look at the vaccine data for Pfizer and Moderna, which probably delayed vaccine approvals by like a month or 6 weeks or something. And the consistent point that the FDA takes longer to approve vaccines than the UK. So I think the UK took a few weeks, or I don't know how long it took exactly, but it took substantially shorter time than the FDA to approve the vaccine once it had been submitted. So that's another issue. And then a big one, I think, was the lack of experimentation with human challenge trials. And I think what a lot of these share is that there's just basically no transparency in a lot of these issues. There also hasn't been very good reporting on a lot of these issues. So there's been some good New York Times reporting on the AstraZeneca issue lately. There was some Washington Post reporting on the testing and scandal and the CDC and the FDA and all that early on. But other than that, there really has not been a lot of substantial, good investigative media attention on all of these issues. And I think that that's a real downside, is to some degree, we don't really know what's going on. It's not really like an FDA reform, but it's something to sort of think about. But I think any attempt to reform should start with like figuring out exactly what went wrong, why it went wrong. And to do that, we need more information. And some possible solutions. I think we need nonpartisan investigation and summary of all the issues that I brought up. I'm very sympathetic to kind of insider track reform that Dan Elton brought up. At least on Twitter, a lot of those prominent think tank writers, a lot of the people that, apparently Biden follows Maddie Iglesias on Twitter, and a lot of the Biden transition team follows Maddie Iglesias on Twitter. And so there's some indications that, some important thought influencers in DC are sympathetic to some FDA critique. So I think that that's pretty promising. I think we need some Freedom of Information Act requests and congressional investigations into a lot of the questions. So like, what role did President Trump actually play in reducing testing? Why do FDA approvals, take a certain amount of time? Why did the FDA delay looking at the vaccine data in October and push it to November? So I think those are sort of not really reform, but those are things we should, try to do. Some narrowly targeted legislation I think would be useful. So, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013 does do things like, I believe it ties the FDA to faster review timelines when there's a public health emergency, but we could probably shorten the timeline even more. We could maybe have more transparency on what exactly is going on so that we can better pressure the FDA to move faster. And I think, something that wasn't really reported on was early on, I think it was in April 2020, Representative Donna Shalala and Representative Bill Foster sent an open letter to the HHS Secretary and the FDA Commissioner stating, we want acceleration of vaccine approval. We want you to consider human challenge trials. It was a very aggressive letter. I was actually really pleasantly surprised by like how forward thinking it was. But it didn't seem to go anywhere in terms of the human challenge trial component. There was very little reporting on this issue. There doesn't seem to have been like a lot of public discussion of this issue outside of, some corners of the internet, like transhumanists, the rationalist community, those sorts of groups. And so I think figuring out why that didn't happen would be a very important first step. Again, it's kind of the lack of transparency issue. We don't really know, like, what were the internal discussions that went on in the FDA when that letter was received. So I think, in general, I would advocate for, we just need to understand the COVID-19 FDA issues in better detail. We need better reporting. We need more transparency. We need some, aggressive congressional investigation. But I don't have a lot of specific policy ideas, but, I enjoyed hearing all of them today.
Thank you very much, Willy, for the nuanced perspective that you provided, outlining both some of the recent flaws in FDA decision-making, as well as perhaps some areas where that agency ultimately did arrive at the correct answer. And I think the challenge for us is, how do we implement any set of potential reforms in a way that doesn't generate backlash or blowback, so that there isn't another thalidomide scare, however stereotypical and overblown that was. We want public opinion to be on our side. So it's quite worthwhile to consider the historical perspective and consider indeed also some of the possible benefits of these safeguards that we would want to preserve. So now we have come to the point in our panel where I would invite our special guests to ask any questions of the panelists, and feel free to either ask a question to a specific panelist or to any panelist who you think could provide some insights in response. So Natasha, please proceed.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for your informative and well-parsed presentations. I'm going to respond to each person and make a point, and that can open further discussion. And if any of the panelists would like to respond, I welcome that. First, Alex, thank you very much. That was highly informative. I enjoyed listening to you very much. What was interesting, as you were speaking, I just did a little bit of due diligence, and I wanted to mention Brian Wang, who in January of 2020 wrote an article called Anti-Aging Treatments That Are Closest to FDA Approval. And on this list, it's quite a unique list of diversity, which I like very much, but I just wanted to point out that Greg Fay, who many of us know quite well, who's been working with the thymus for a number of years in his case studies, is on that list of being closest to FDA approval. We don't have a chat open, so I can't put the link there, but I welcome you to find it at Next Big Future, Anti-Aging Treatments That Are Closest to FDA Approval. And again, thank you, Alex, so much. Max, I'd like to nod to your, hold on, focus, your comment about, sorry about the focus here, your analogy about the red team, blue team, which is a cybersecurity testing format, which I've been deeply involved in for a number of years, is a fascinating analogy to use within testing and looking for the any type of false clues or viable truths within testing. So I enjoyed that very much. So thank you, Max, so much. Jim, I value your insights about the FDA. I think it's really important for us not to damn institutions that have been around for a very long time, because I have done worthwhile studies, and those studies are very momentous and important for us to build new knowledge from. So I find the FDA, however bureaucratic and large it is, it's very important not to insult it too much, to understand that it is a big machine, and that big machine may take some gentle finessing in addressing it. So with Garett, I think that your comments, and I think that disrespecting establishments through intellectual mistakes is a misnomer, and most of us who are scholars or authors and scientists and researchers know this very well. And I like the idea of the high economic value of another organization that could come along and maybe offer some alternative to the FDA. So that brings all organizations up the ante rather than below. There's two comments I'd like to make, and I hope that you all bring this into discussion. I'll go over these very quickly. Cosmetics does not need FDA approval post-marketing. It only needs approval pre-marketing, and it only needs approval post-marketing if it says anything in its marketing protocols that could be misleading. Well, I find that very irregular. The FDA is very loosey-goosey on that, which disturbs me a great deal. So many cosmetic companies and cosmetic surgeons are pushing stuff that is not healthy and not good. And I don't know how on earth the FDA lets this happen, other than there's someone pulling the strings or it makes too much money. And the last comment I'm going to make along those lines are, we all know about Theranos, Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes Company. And it's the largest embarrassment to the longevity community that we've ever realized. And what astounds me is that in 2015, I think it was, I could check my notes on that, but Theranos actually got FDA approval for its blood test, but that blood test was for, I think it was a venereal disease or a herpes. But that disturbs me a great deal. How did they get FDA approval when they didn't even have the invention, the machine? That was just total bullshit. So I think that there's some imbalance here. That why do cosmetic companies get away with pre-marketing, not approved, but no nonsense? It's okay, but it's only post-marketing. And why does a company that is known to have been not only extremely unethical through its core, but falsifying information data, get an element of FDA approval? So I'll just leave you with that. And again, thank you each and every one of you. I learned from your presentations and enjoyed it very much.
Yes, thank you, Natasha, for those remarks, and I'll invite any of the panelists to address them shortly. I do want to note that Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, I think now for reasons that are understandable in retrospect, didn't really get themselves involved in our community. They didn't really try to collaborate with or ask the input of any true longevity researchers or transhumanists or policy experts. I think if they had engaged in greater depth with our community, some of the flaws in their approach would have been pointed out a lot sooner. But now let us proceed to the panelists. Any responses to Natasha's remarks? Edward.
Yeah, just a quick thing, because you mentioned aftermarket issues with cosmetics. One of the interesting things with FDA is that they do have a process for looking at aftermarket uses of already approved drugs, because if you waited till you knew absolutely everything about a product, it probably never would get out there at all. And so they're always updating labels, because they literally get several million bits of input each year on this label. It's a little bit better if you use it this way, that way, and so forth. So they're always changing labels. They have a process for collecting the information and doing that. There's also a medical device innovation consortium now that does the same thing for medical devices. The difference is, though, it's kind of a private consortium. FDA is a member, other stakeholders are members, to look at and to especially be attentive to patient use of medical devices after it's been approved. So that, first of all, safety, and it's obviously an important issue, and also whether the patient is satisfied, because the manufacturers would like to know, look, this just doesn't work if you're a child who needs a replacement limb and it's just not working for the child. It's important to get that data. So we already have a system within FDA, or working with FDA for medical devices, to do that aftermarket research. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that I say that if you just, in a sense, push it back and say that this kind of real world data coming in can be used before something is officially certified, you can speed the process of eliminating the bad stuff, because none of us here, and this is your point, the point about Theranos is very good. None of us on this call, none of us associated with the Transhumanist Party or any of these groups, want poison and bad stuff going out there. We all want to live long. We all want our friends and families and sons and daughters to live long. So that's one of the things I like about this group. And thank you, Gennady, for setting it up, is we really believe in integrity. We really want the best results. So thanks for your comments.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Edward. Any further responses from the panel?
Yeah, I think Natasha's comment is exceptionally well taken on how FDA can basically level up to the level of other institutions. So I might disagree with the other people on the panel on which are the institutions that are the models, but we live in a world of 188 countries, and there are a lot of different government agencies in all these countries. And rather than reinvent the wheel or go back to the chalkboard and come up with ideal agencies in theory, we can learn a lot by looking at the actual practice of well-performing government agencies that have to make important decisions that whose impacts last decades into the future.
I would just briefly add to that, Garrett. I think that's always good to look at good practices in history. I would say also weight what you see by how long they've been in operation, because sometimes organizations can start off really good for 5 years, 10 years, and then they kind of decay. We know, there's regulatory capture and so on. So if you see something working pretty well, but it's only been around for 5 years, we should be a little bit cautious about adopting that model, but I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Exactly. Founder effects are important, right? We need to know how to study an institution means to look at a successful institution more or less regardless of who's in charge after it's been through a couple of generations. So 100 years might be a good time frame, but we're well into 100 years after the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So we have a lot of different, we have dozens, maybe hundreds of interesting examples of government agencies across the rich countries well worth thinking about.
Yes, indeed. Now we have a question from Jose Cordero.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, my question goes exactly in that line. But first of all, let me congratulate you because this has been an outstanding event, and I am very happy. Also, in case that you haven't read it, you have to read the Transhumanist Reader, which was compiled by Natasha and Max. In fact, yes, excellent, excellent. Max Moore wrote about the Fractionary Principle. So I am connecting from Madrid, from Spain, from Europe. And my view is actually sad because if you think the FDA is bad, you have to look at the European Medicines Agency. So even though Alex, he mentioned Tabarrok about Germany and so on and so forth, maybe for a few cases, but whatever the USA does has a major impact throughout the planet. And the European Medicines Agency is much worse than the FDA. So also, that is why Garett Jones' comment about competition is very important. We do need more competition, actually. And maybe Garett wants to talk about this, or Ed, because I know you also know what is happening in Japan, what is happening in China. We need competition, even from communist countries. So that's my question, my comment, and congratulations once again.
Garett, you want to start, and then I'll chip in?
Really, what I wanted to do is hear Alex talk about regulatory competition. But I think of this general idea that learning from the models of other countries and treating their institutional reforms as something we can learn from is a universal value. I mean, we should, there's too much of the not invented here syndrome in corporate America. We all know that, but that's especially true in democracies when democracies are choosing their forms of governance. People get way too patriotic when it comes to issues of what makes for good regulatory systems. Alex's idea, which is I'm sure many of you embrace, about allowing a drug approval or a medical device approval in other countries and other selected countries to serve as de facto approval in the US, that seems just like common sense. Again, inventing the wheel is unwise when it comes to institutional forms or to regulatory approvals.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Jose, and add to that, Japan has actually adopted the free to choose medicine approach for certain kinds of medications, biosimilars and medications, especially aimed at the elderly. There's some problems with their system. I don't think it's liberal enough, but that's another issue. But they have adopted that. I understand in Switzerland, and Jose, you might have some comments on this. They do have more of the, regulating the laboratories, where if I have a proposed medication, I can go to this lab or this lab or this lab to have it tested, and therefore you have the competition between the labs. The test labs. It's kind of like, imagine a number of underwriters' laboratories. And the only way they can keep their business is if they're honest. If they approve some product that really turns out to be bogus, then no one is going to ever go to them anymore. They probably would be certified. And so that issue of competition within a country works, as well as competition between countries. By the way, it's interesting because every time, not the last couple of times, that I think it was 3 years ago when I went to the FDA annual conference, they were very big on, I've got some of the graphs here, but I won't show them right now, on how much better they are in certain areas than Europe in terms of how quickly they approve products. So Jose, your point is correct, but even so, I can give examples. For example, you probably know 20, 30 years ago, beta blockers, which were available in Britain, were not available in the United States for quite a few years. And Louis Lasagna, who was a late researcher, came up with a number of about 100,000 people may have died from heart problems who could have been saved during the time that beta blockers were not available here, but were available in the UK. So we've had situations here where our FDA has stumbled and the Europeans have done differently, though the FDA has tried to catch up in recent years.
Let me just make a quick comment based on that, Ed, because indeed Switzerland is a very interesting example, also because it's not part of the European Union, as you know, and it's a relatively free country, and it has a lot of pharmaceutical companies. It is actually amazing that such a small, tiny country like Switzerland has some of the leading companies in the pharma industry. But there is also now Britain, which left the European Union because of Brexit. Also, they have a more advanced regulatory policy. So I think we will have more competition in the future. And just to finalize, you talked about Japan, but again, now China is coming in, and China has a rapidly aging population. So China will also probably change the rules of the game also in their favor.
Let me make a couple of points about reciprocity.
You probably know there's been a situation in FDA does, and in fact, when I was looking at the Japanese situation, I found that there were cases where the FDA said, we've looked at the data from Japan and we just say, it looks good, so we're going to approve this product or certify this product because it looks good with Japanese data. So there are examples where FDA actually does that, maybe not as much as we would like.
Alex, please proceed.
Sure. So reciprocity goes both ways. That's the point, right? So yes, absolutely. The Germans have something to gain from the US. The US approves a lot of drugs quickly, and the Germans ought to follow, as many countries do. Like even an advanced country like New Zealand, they don't have all of the capacity to review drugs the way the FDA does. So although they don't say this, they mostly follow what the FDA does, and that's smart. I do worry about this, however, actually. So here's an argument against reciprocity, because if you go too far down the line of reciprocity, it becomes sort of international harmonization, and you just get one regulatory rule across the whole world or across all the industrial nations. And that's actually problematic because we do want the competition. So you got to be careful with reciprocity that you don't go too far and get too much international harmony. And I'm struck, for example, that with human challenge trials and COVID, okay, no country did human challenge trials, only Britain very late, right? That to me is shocking. Like not even China. We always think about China, as sort of being on the cutting edge of being willing to do things which other countries are not. But China now is pulling back from cloning and pulling back from CRISPR on human beings and things like that. So China is pulling back from the edge, which I think actually is unfortunate in my view. And no country, as I said, except Britain, until very, very recently, they've done kind of a minor human challenge trial. So in Britain, they're doing a human challenge trial to get ready to do human challenge trials. So they are testing how much COVID do we have to give somebody, how much SARS do we have to give someone? How much of the virus do we have to give someone to actually test it? So the fact that no country in the world did this, even though a human challenge trial is eminently sensible and would have saved many thousands of lives, I think is actually very worrying.
Yes, thank you for those responses. And now I will ask if there are any other questions from our guests in the session. Let's see. I'm not hearing any questions unless Charlie, you want to ask one.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Gennady. I had a question for Jim O'Neill. When I was running, excuse me, when I was running for president on the USTP ticket, a lot of times the subject of the longevity escape velocity would come up, and I would always reference the SENS Foundation because they're really at the forefront of making that happen. And my question is, do you think that the FDA is in any way, hindering that happening sooner rather than later, or you had a positive response about them, which I understood and I agree with to an extent. So I wanted to know what's your opinion, and also do they even understand that kind of thinking, that kind of transhumanist thought at the FDA about longevity, escape velocity, or any of the things that we discussed in these kind of communities? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I don't think they are familiar with the concept of longevity escape velocity. But in terms of what they can do to be better, as I said before, I think defining aging as a condition that is treatable is actually not the problem there. The best things FDA could do to speed up escape velocity is the things that we've been talking about that would apply to all kinds of treatments, such as progressive approval and faster approvals. The things that would make it easier to treat all diseases are the things FDA could do to make it easier to treat aging. And among those, there's one that I want to add that we've barely discussed, which is the cost, the expense that it takes to get a drug approved. So Alex mentioned the PDUFA law that was passed in 1992 that put massive user fees on even submitting a drug to FDA for approval. Now, this was paired with FDA committing to certain timelines to make a decision, not necessarily a positive decision, but a decision. So it was pro-innovation in that sense, but it was anti-innovation in the sense that it became much more expensive to sponsor a drug. And one of the reasons that that's a problem is that it concentrates power among the largest pharma companies. Another reason it's a problem is that lots of very promising therapies are not patentable, either because they're natural products like plants or because their patents have long since expired. Therefore, it's very hard to recoup the cost of the user fees and of paying for the randomized controlled trials. Therefore, few people are willing to invest in this. So one area that some of this group might be familiar with is the area of psychedelic medicine. Psychedelic medicine is very promising. Substances like MDMA and psilocybin and many others have a great potential to treat social anxiety and treatment-resistant depression and many other mental health conditions. And yet most of them are not patentable. And therefore, it's very hard to gather the amount of investment or donations that you need to pay the user fees and pay for the trials. So we need to reshuffle the financial and economic situation around drug approvals, and that would help with a lot of anti-aging therapies as well if it weren't so expensive as well as slow to get things approved.
Let me disagree with Jim in one part and agree in another. The part I disagree with is that PDUFA raised a cost. No, PDUFA reduced the costs for pharmaceutical firms because time is money. So they'd much rather pay the money and have more staff on hand at the FDA to get the drug through faster. That actually lowers the net cost, lowers the total cost. Where I agree, however, is on the non-patentable stuff and the difficulty of getting non-patented or non-patentable approvals or new drugs or devices, not just through the FDA process, but researched and developed to begin with. I actually think here that the NIH should be doing a lot more, and we should have more funding for the NIH. If you think about it, it's actually very peculiar in one way that we require the drug firms to run the tests on their own products. Like that's a kind of a strange way of doing things, right? It seems, it's sort of built in, but like, why do we do it that way? It might be better, if we had government pay for the trials. People are going to say, oh, well, blah, 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 it's too expensive. But let's put aside that. The point is that having the NIH, a independent, unbiased institution, run more clinical trials could actually be very beneficial. And the NIH can do this on things which are non-patentable or things where their patent has expired. So there's lots of, as Jim knows very well, there's lots of drugs which are used off-label. So the drug was initially on patent and the patent is expired. It's used off-label for something entirely different than for what it was originally approved for. And nobody really has an incentive to test that off-label use, even if it has become quite prevalent and has become the standard which doctors use, which physicians use. And an excellent example of this is the women's trial on the estrogen, which actually showed that a common estrogen after menopause, which was commonly prescribed, not only did not help women, but was actually harming them. So I agree with Jim that there's a lot of room for more clinical trials on non-patented and off-patented drugs to discover new uses for these drugs and to clarify the value of old uses.
By the way,
I want to just jump in and make 2 points before Ed. The first is, we have a lot of transhumanists that are always talking about how the FDA needs to classify aging as disease. I purposely left that off because the impression I'm getting from Aubrey de Grey is actually not that important, and companies can basically use a loophole where they invent or they use a series of biomarkers that are highly correlated with aging. But however, I do wonder if there could be some value to actually formally recognizing aging as a human health hazard, and as an indication. So you could actually have a drug that is approved for aging. I wonder if that could change people's thinking, and actually incentivize anti-aging biotechnology and things like that. So that's one point. And then, and then the other point is, I also think that, we should be talking about government investments, because one of the problems is that people dismiss a lot of the arguments that we've just made because they say, oh, X person is a libertarian, which, some of us here are a few of us here are associated with libertarian organizations or organizations that are considered libertarian. And therefore, a lot of DC policy people just dismiss them. Which is obviously very unfair, but we need to be putting together a policy package that has some progressive ideas as well. And so one of those would be what Alex Tabarrok just said, which is greater government investment in RCTs, especially for things that are generic drugs that companies wouldn't be able to make a lot of money off of, or unpatented drugs, drugs that have passed their patent. So that's where economists come in and they use this idea of value of information to determine what would be the most valuable RCTs to run, to figure out is drug A better than drug B for a certain condition. And these certain RCTs could be enormously valuable to taxpayers, and those could be government funded. So I think it's important to point out these more non-libertarian ideas as well. Partly it's just a matter of strategy.
By the way, Dan, one thing I'd be a little bit wary of on the economic side is, for example, I believe it was the Jarvik artificial heart, when the FDA was considering that, one of their arguments against it was at the time they said, well, it'll cost, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of dollars, and therefore is it really worth it because healthcare costs are going too high? And if you understand Moore's law, you understand that something might come on at $200,000 and then it goes to 100,000, then it goes to 50,000, and then so, I'm a little wary because I've seen some of the FDA's actual decisions where they try to define efficacy in terms of economic efficacy, and the decisions are not always very good decisions. It should be, look, is the thing going to kill you or not? And if the answer is no, and there's some efficacy there, well, then you let people decide whether they want to pay money for it. It was the tough study. We've been talking about the cost, and it was the tough study of 2014 or 15, I believe, that found that it costs about $3 billion and 10 to 12 years to get a new product from research lab to market. And that was taking into account, by the way, Alex, that time is money, and capital costs have to be included when you're looking at that. And so that's where that high cost comes in. But one of the things that I'm hoping to do, and I've talked to some of you folks offline about this, is in terms of long-term strategy, raising the consciousness of policymakers, influencers here in DC and elsewhere about the promise of exponential technology, about how there are certain things that might have been developed, but they were stopped in midstream because of FDA regulations. This is nonpartisan or bipartisan, or however you want to define it. 40 states passed right to try. And these weren't all just Republican states or just Democrat states. They were pretty much bipartisan because, hey, if you're terminally ill or you have a relative terminally ill, your party label does not matter. And so that's kind of the approach that I'm going to be taking and moving ahead. And I know a number of you are going to be taking with policymakers and influencers, is basically saying it's not a matter whether I'm called a libertarian or you're called a Democrat or whatever. It's pointing out the promise of this technology, the promise of what we can do in the future, and then getting people excited about it, and they'll go, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know that they've actually sequenced telomerase in Paris in, 2018, April, was that right? And what that means. So I just see a potential of raising consciousness among influencers about what's possible. And then they'll start saying, well, what's keeping it back? Well, we need to look at FDA and CDC, by the way. That's a whole nother discussion we can have, perhaps.
All right.
I just want to
Willy,
jump in.
yes.
Oh, sorry. I just want to jump in and say I agree with Dan Elton that at the very least for strategic purposes, it's very good to remain, nonpartisan, because one of the big flaws, I think, in the COVID response was because Trump was such a polarizing figure, a ton of policy and organizational decisions became tainted by politics immediately. So, when the FDA issued those emergency authorizations for hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma, that was kind of seen as, political interference. And then when it turned out that they really didn't work, that was very good ammunition for critics of the FDA, quote unquote, rushing through vaccine development. So I think we have to be very aware and strategic about political polarization and the effects it's going to have. So I just want to agree that, if you want to reform the FDA, you just have to accept that that's going to be coded as right wing. And so you have to neutralize that, with other good policy prescriptions, like more funding for the NIH to run, non-conflicted trials and, to get back against big pharma by funding government science. So, yeah. And by the way, there's a great book called Ending Medical Reversal by a doctor and health policy researcher, Dr. Vinay Prasad, that has a very nice section at the end about proposals to run clinical trial infrastructure partially through the government. And I think Dr. Tabarrok and Dan Elton might enjoy that book.
Yeah, I think Dan is right about how the libertarian label can be harmful in pushing reforms. I'll state one policy position that sounds not libertarian, which is that I would massively increase FDA's budget and massively increase the salaries of the scientists who work there. Now, that's non-libertarian in the sense that it's libertarian to support less government funding. Of course, it is libertarian in that the hope for effects would be a lighter burden of regulation and faster approvals. There are lots of areas where your average median person has a libertarian view, they just don't use that label. And so one label that I would argue is very useful is burden of proof. So since 1962, FDA has operated on a guilty until proven innocent standard, which if you phrase it that way, most people realize how unfair that is. And there are many examples of why this is horrible, but one that I would point to in particular is testing. I used to clash with FDA over testing a lot when I was in the Bush administration, and they were claiming the power to have guilty until proven innocent for all matter of pure algorithms. And the reason that is now a very approachable area for your average person is the harm that caused in COVID. So the genome for SARS-CoV-2 virus was posted on the internet on, I think, like January 5th. Anyone could have turned that into a test, and both WHO and Germany did this. Therefore, Germany was able to have widespread testing in January of 2020. Because of FDA and its policies, we didn't have widespread testing in the US. In some ways, we still don't. Even last summer and fall, it was very hard to get tested if you didn't have both symptoms and a doctor's note. And that is utterly ridiculous. Hundreds of thousands of people died because of that philosophy among FDA. And when you're talking about the invisible graveyard, that's a big section of it.
Yeah, I'd like to say our antibodies ourselves.
Yeah, Jim, I have
Well,
to.
great
Said, in fact, on the blog post I hope to finish today, I was just writing about that is the experience of Dr. Helen Chu, for instance, after the CDC sent out like 160,000 botched tests that were completely useless. Instead of saying, oops, we made a mistake, maybe we should listen to the wisdom of others and give them a chance, they actually shut down everybody else. Dr. Chu had all these swabs taken from people with COVID-19, wanted to test them. They said, nope, you can't do that. Not allowed, stop testing. Even though they screwed up their test, they were not allowing anybody else to do any testing. So yeah, that's pretty disastrous approach. It's a very arrogant approach too, that we're the only people who can actually do this, even though we just showed that we're not competent. Nobody else is allowed to have a chance. It's kind of scary. And I have to say to Alex, as someone who's been a hardcore libertarian and then kind of backed off on that and is now actually feeling more libertarian because I think more and more it seems to work pretty well. Your idea is pretty intriguing. I have to think about that in terms of the NIH doing trials. I have to give that some thought. I'm pretty sure there's going to be some downsides to that, but that's intriguing, and I want to give that some real thought. Just to quickly throw out a thought, which I'm pretty sure is a bad idea in itself. There's been talk of vaccine passports. Now, I'm just as we're having this discussion, it came to mind a different kind of vaccine passport might be, and again, I'm pretty sure this is a bad idea. What if there was the objection to letting people try things is that they don't know anything, they don't know how to evaluate trials, they don't know how to evaluate risks, they don't know, how to compare the probability of dying from what they're taking with the probability of dying if they don't take it. Of course, the main problem with that kind of line of argument is, well, if people are not responsible enough to make decisions about their personal welfare, why the hell are they responsible enough to vote for politicians who are going to control everybody? So that's kind of one problem with that. But suppose someone said, well, let's have a vaccine passport in a different sense. If you can pass a test that requires some kind of probabilistic reasoning and showing some kind of knowledge and reasoning ability, if you can pass that, you get a vaccine passport. That means you can try out any kind of vaccine or other medicine that may have a potential benefit. I don't know. I suspect that could be badly gamed, but just a thought just came to mind. Tell me how bad an idea that is.
Well, interestingly, the U.S. Transhumanist Party has been advocating for any willing volunteers to be able to take a vaccine ahead of FDA authorization. much of the public still does not know this, but the Moderna vaccine was essentially developed over the course of a weekend in January 2020. And if one just thinks about what the outcome would have been had that vaccine been made available just to volunteers, and I understand much of the population would have been reluctant to be first, but some people who understood the science would have been more than willing, and then the results would have spoken for themselves. Anybody who essentially had gotten that vaccine earlier on would have had a much lower probability of contracting COVID-19. And empirically, people would have learned from that, and more volunteers would have signed up. We might not have had a pandemic at all. We certainly would not have had the 550,000 plus death toll in the United States. So I think this is a good opportunity to begin bridging into some of the audience questions, and also connecting those with the questions of strategy that Dan Elton raised in his presentation. So David Wood asked, with regard to one of the strategies mentioned, essentially why seek a critical mass of angry voters as opposed to a critical mass of engaged voters. And this is, I think, a broader question. How much impact does public outrage have as contrasted with just public interest and participation? So with the AIDS activists, for instance, in the 1990s, to what extent did their extremely, let's say, provocative demonstrations influence the FDA's judgments, as contrasted with just a group of people who all of a sudden became a lot more involved in the process, and the FDA essentially could not avoid paying attention to their concerns? I invite any thoughts from the panelists on that question.
Here's the problem, and as I see it, it's 550,000 dead people in the United States due to COVID, and yet there's very little public outrage. Trump almost got reelected, right? And a lot has to be put at his door, but very little outrage about not approving the AstraZeneca vaccine. Very little interest outside of these kind of circles in why the Pfizer vaccine was delayed, even though, I mean, Nancy Pelosi and Topol and a bunch of people kind of pushed that because they didn't want Trump to be reelected, right? And that was very obvious. It was like totally obvious that was what was going on. Very little public pushback. So if 550,000 dead people are not going to get the public interested in FDA reform, then I think the second strategy, which Dan outlined, which was going to kind of a minority of people like Ezra Klein, who wrote this piece, was pretty nice about me, that's kind of like illustrative that that's a possibility, that you can get technocrats thinking about these kinds of issues. You can get smart people on the left, liberals, conservatives, Matt Iglesias, people like that. You can get them thinking about these issues, and you can get physicians thinking about these issues. Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of people who I think might make a difference, rather than the public, which, to quote Ayn Rand, are sort of social ballast, right? So, up and down, but they don't have a big influence.
It just occurred to me, I've learned how much influence Eric Topol had, and it's from what I can infer, it's astounding. It seems like he almost single-handedly prevented the Pfizer vaccine from getting the emergency use authorization. So actually, it just occurred to me, maybe we need to find people with huge reputation within the medical establishment to come out and support some of the ideas. That's you just mentioned that, and I think that's a great idea.
By the way, since we were talking about whether FDA should be an independent agency, I will point out that it was Henry Waxman, who, by the way, is very, very liberal Democrat in the late 80s and 90s, who really put the pressure on the FDA to create the parallel track for AIDS medications. That one AIDS medication, as I think Willie, you mentioned, was the one that actually got on there, but they were trying to do things. But it was Waxman basically saying, guys, this is insane. You got 50,000 people dying a year. That's unacceptable. We have to do something about this. But I do think that, again, what my strategy has been is working inside, so to speak, working with folks on Capitol Hill. And unfortunately, Alex, you were correct. Things were so partisan the last 2 years that, people like me who are working on the Hill were trying to reach out to folks, Democrats as well. They just wouldn't talk to each other, and it was really bad. So we're hoping that we'll get a better result this time around. And I would think, unfortunately, when I looked at the fact that it was David Kessler is one of Biden's top advisors, and he was one of the problems in the 1990s at FDA, as far as I'm concerned. I was writing about looking at it back then. And Ezekiel Emanuel, who said we should all die at, he said he wants to die at 75, has been another advisor. So I'm not particularly fond of somebody who thinks, the president he serves is slightly over 75. So I would think that Mr. Biden would be a little bit concerned about this. But on the other hand, seriously, Biden's son died of cancer. And I know that this is a very personal thing for Joe Biden. He set up a cancer organization. And I think he's sincere about this, whatever you agree one way or the other about his other politics. So I think that there are ways now that you can reach, that say this is a bipartisan thing, and you can in fact engage with some of the influencers and sort of move things along that way. And also, by the way, to reach out to people like Liz Parrish and others who are on the cutting edge and say, guys, can you tell us exactly what you would like to see? You don't want your people using your treatments to die. No one wants that. Can you tell us if you were blue skying it and coming up with a regulatory arrangement that would protect patients, but would allow you to move as quickly as possible? Tell us what you would like. And having that kind of input would be very powerful, going to members of Congress and saying, here's someone who's trying to cure AIDS, who's trying to cure Alzheimer's, who's trying to cure all of these diseases. Here's what they say would really be helpful. The problem I've discovered for, unfortunately, decades of working on Capitol Hill is a lot of these folks are scared to come forward and say that because there is a regulatory agency that can stop their stuff. And so they've got to be a little bit cautious. And that's a public policy, public choice issue, as some of you probably understand.
Yes, indeed. And David Wood also suggests that it would be worth discussing the case of Eric Topol further. His involvement in the Vioxx scandal clearly helped orient his thinking. On the whole, David Wood writes that what Topol writes about medicine in his 3 books is generally futuristic and positive. And I had the same impression when I looked at Topol's Wikipedia page and his prior involvement in discussions on the future of medicine. So David Wood thinks Topol ought to be an ally, and there is this jarring contrast between Topol's prior work and his stance on the COVID-19 vaccines. My impression is it was motivated by, frankly, Democratic Party partisanship, because there were a few months in late 2020, shortly before the presidential election, when it seemed to me the Democratic Party temporarily became an anti-vaxxer party en masse, just because Donald Trump was advocating for faster approval, or at least emergency use authorizations of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And the Democrats essentially were opposed to everything that Trump supported and supported everything that Trump opposed. So what does everyone think about Eric Topol and why he made this very aggressive push to delay the EUAs for Pfizer and Moderna vaccines? Is it purely partisanship, or is it something else as well?
Well, I mean, I can't read his mind, but what happened was, after the FDA did their emergency use authorization on remdesivir, and they kind of overhyped it, Topol was worried about the FDA reputation being damaged. He's one of these guys who obsessively worries about the reputational harm that might occur. And my question for someone like Topol is, how many lives are you willing to sacrifice on that altar? You know, he's obsessively worried about that if the FDA approved a vaccine before the election, this is going to somehow harm the reputation. I don't know. I see the other way, like, but he's obsessed about that. And so he pushed very strongly for the FDA, for Pfizer, for the FDA to make sure that Pfizer's vaccine was not approved before the election. The other issue with I've had with Eric Topol is he engages in what I would call fear mongering. So, for instance, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, he's written that AstraZeneca's screwing up their trial. The trials, he said things like their phase 3 trial is useless. He said it was actually several trials in one. He basically, and so he's trying to be a champion for high standards of rigor and stuff, but his statements, I would categorize as fear mongering. And just, so I used to respect Eric Topol a lot because he's written very favorably on the use of AI in medicine. But I've sort of lost all respect for him just seeing his fear mongering on Twitter, and then also his behavior on Twitter, where he engages in a lot of blocking. A lot of people I've talked to on Twitter are blocked by him, which I think is a little bit telling of his personality.
Yes, thank you, Dan. Now, Alex, before you depart, any last words either on Eric Topol or any of the subjects discussed?
It looks like Eric Topol might come out for delaying the second dose. So he has been on the fence, but he's been against it. But now Atul Gawande came out in favor of delaying the second dose. And Eric has been saying, things like, hey, maybe it's not such a bad idea after all. So I hope that he, in fact, will come out to delay the second dose, which won't be so important in the United States. Unfortunately, we're past that time where it would really be a big deal in the United States. But for the rest of the world, we still have an extreme scarcity of vaccines. And it's going to be extremely important to stretch the doses as far as we can. So delaying that second dose, getting more first doses out, which brings people from 0 to 80% protected. That is much more important, going from 0 to 80 than it is going from 80 to 95% protected. We want people to get the second dose, but it's not really a problem to wait, 12 weeks, or as they have done in Great Britain, or 16 weeks as they're doing in Canada, until the scarcity of vaccines is alleviated. We need to stretch the doses as far as we can. Aside from delaying the second dose, we ought to be investigating much more closely the possibility of using half doses, which has been done in previous pandemics successfully. And we could use like half doses, for example, in the young under 55, and we could use, full doses in the elderly who are much more at risk. Again, these considerations are not so important for the United States right now, which is going to have which has a lot of vaccine and is going to have a lot of vaccine, enough to vaccinate the entire population very soon. But for the rest of the world, these ideas are absolutely key to saving lives and ending the pandemic much quicker.
Can I just add a quick comment to what Alex said, because I think a lot of people maybe don't understand this. When you talk about 80% effective, a lot of people misunderstand that. As I understand it, that means that 80% effective against basically getting any symptoms whatsoever. It's a lot more than 80% effective against hospitalization or death, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So thank you, Alex, and thank you, Max, as well, for that important reminder. Indeed, anyone vaccinated with any of the vaccines that are widely in use, essentially, from my understanding, is almost guaranteed to avoid hospitalization and death. And that's the major reason to get vaccinated that people forget about. So now let us proceed to some
Gennady, sorry to interrupt you. We should say at this point, if anyone wants to leave, they can.
Yes, we do have some audience questions. If anyone would like to stay and discuss them as well, that would also be welcomed. So we have a question from David Wood about reciprocity for those who would like to address it in greater detail. How would a reciprocity principle arbitrate between two trusted countries giving conflicting advice about approving or rejecting a drug? So let's say Germany is approving this drug and the US is rejecting it, or Canada decides to approve the drug and the UK decides to reject it, whichever the countries may be. Are there any general principles for those who advocate reciprocity about how the FDA or another country's regulatory agency should deal with that?
Well, I'll say one thing is it would certainly, we're talking about the importance of transparency. And in one sense, this would force a little bit more transparency. If the Germans say this is really great and we're going to approve it, and the Americans or some other country says doesn't look very good to us, that would be interesting to know. I've mentioned the example of beta blockers, some decades ago. And actually, we can look into why the United States and why our FDA, delayed beta blockers for so many years and unfortunately cost so many lives. But one thing I would say is that at least it would create some pressure for, either if America's FDA approves a product and Germans are saying, hey, we're suffering and dying over here, why can't you, the Germans, approve this? At least it would get a discussion about methodology, which I think is very important, because what I maintain is that the Fractionary Principle is going to be even more important in the future with exponential technology, and that this is going to hopefully get that discussion. Now, by the way, Alex, I think, has dropped off here, but he did mention a concern about reciprocity, that it could come up with this kind of international mush of regulations, which may not be a good idea. And I certainly take that danger. One of the examples I give when we talk about Brexit is the banana example, where they have these regulations which exactly what kind of an angle constitutes a banana. And it was silly stuff like that that caused a lot of people in Britain to say, we've got to get out of Brexit, these people are nuts. Or you want to talk about actually a health issue, or what seems like a health issue. I was in Hungary in 2004 or something like that, and talking to them about entering the EU, and they were sort of excited about it because it was going to be a lot better than the East Bloc that had just collapsed. But they were saying, well, we're concerned if we're going to have to redo our milk industry. And I said, well, why? Is your milk unhealthy? Are people dropping dead in Budapest because of bad milk? Well, no, it's just that we do it a little bit differently and our people like it that way. And I said, well, why not just label it Magyar milk and people can choose to buy it or not? And they said, well, the regulators in Europe just say we have to do it a certain way. And so there is a danger of reciprocity, that you could get countries together to sort of say, well, let's have these sorts of agreements that could, in the end, maybe freeze in bad ideas. That's why I go back to the idea of some kind of a parallel track, that once a product is determined to be safe and at least one or two efficacy tests, it can be offered if the manufacturer wants it, so you're getting real world data in. So there are upsides and there's some downsides as well to the reciprocity issue.
Just to piggyback quickly on Ed's point, which I think is very good in response to David Wood's question. I think it would be great to have Britain saying, yeah, we think this is fine, and you were saying we don't think it is, or Germany, or whatever. Well, why is that? Let's start burrowing into your methodology, your decision-making principles. How did you come to that conclusion? What kind of thresholds did you set? How many people did you check? It's kind of digs again into, you mentioned the Fractionary Principle that specifies that you use the best decision-making methods possible, and there are some pretty well-validated decision methods. So was it just one bureaucrat said, well, I feel kind of uncomfortable, so let's not allow it, or did they actually follow good procedures? So that is a push really towards making more open what kind of decision procedures were used by each side and exactly why they're disagreeing. It would help bring much more public the methods that are used, because right now it's pretty much a black box. What do we know about what the different regulators use? So maybe that's actually a benefit of this kind of situation rather than a downside.
All right. So a related question comes from Nicholas Kwan, who asks, why did the Prime Minister of Israel advertise that the FDA had approved the Pfizer vaccine to encourage people to get vaccinated? And Nicholas suggests this is because Israelis trust the FDA more than their own government. To me, that is kind of strange because Israel has been one of the countries on the cutting edge of combating the COVID-19 epidemic. I think it's perhaps the only country that has a higher vaccination rate among its population than the US has right now. So why do you think Israel would have such deference to the FDA?
Well, I think first of all, it's not the only one. Actually, the UAE and the Seychelles and a few other areas, mostly small countries, have higher vaccination rates. But maybe one reason is if you look at the population of Israel, anyone want to guess what it is without checking? It's pretty small. It's a little bit larger than Arizona. It's like 9 million people. So maybe the thinking there is we don't have enough people and money to fund a good agency to look at that. That's kind of just a pure guess, but that could be the case.
I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu is also facing some corruption charges or something for like the billionth time. So, there may be some of that as well. And also just historically, the FDA has this reputation as like the world's strictest, drug regulatory agency. So I think any country that wants to say it works for sure will point to the strictest example.
Interesting. Now, Jason Mallory suggests perhaps organizational panel licensing could outsource FDA activities and be a pro-budgetary measure similar to third-party DMV services among states. So what does everyone think of perhaps outsourcing some FDA functions to private reviewer agencies, essentially?
Well, I personally haven't thought about that a whole lot because I think it's one of the hardest things to do. So in other words, one of the hardest things to do would be to actually abolish the FDA and have it all privatized. Theoretically, it could work, but I see some value to centralization here personally, but it's not something I'm more interested in, like working on the margins, like what is tractable to do now, rather than theoretical concepts like full privatization. But I'm curious to hear what other panelists have to say about that.
There may be a strategic advantage to having some people that are, advocating a little more extreme views as long as they're not associated with you. So one of the interesting things that the book Reputation and Power mentions is that as part of the bureaucratic fight between the National Cancer Institute and the FDA in the 1970s, I think it was, the NCI, which wanted, much looser FDA regulation on cancer drugs, there was another group, the American Cancer Society, that was pushing a congressman to write a law that would strip the FDA of the authority to regulate cancer drugs at all. And so in the end, there was basically this compromise between the NCI and the FDA, and that resulted in, much to some degree looser standards for cancer drugs. So there was sort of this threat of, strip the FDA of specific authority, which obviously is like the existential threat to the FDA, which then yielded a compromise. So as long as, the people advocating for certain extreme ideas are not really affiliated with you, then it's not the worst thing. But I do think, as always, there's a risk of you want to remain nonpartisan and you want to try to thread the needle of reforms that are effective, that, smart people and think tanks and influence and, DC influencers will like, but that doesn't provoke, the politicization that, that poisons politics.
By the way, a lot of the testing is in fact not, I like to point out, it's not done at the FDA headquarters, and either here in Rockville or in White Oak or just down the road here. It is done in private laboratories usually, or the laboratories of the companies that are sponsoring the treatment, and then the FDA basically reviews it. And the FDA, through various mechanisms that you all probably know, will often work very closely, depending on what the classification of the product is. We'll work very closely on, well, can you try a little bit more of this? Give us a little bit more of that, and we'll move it along quicker. And so there is a lot of that going on right now. It's not fully going on.
Anything that would reduce the problem of a central point of failure would probably be good. So if some of the regulatory decisions could be made competitive, that would probably be good. So perhaps you could have a branch that is for the safety nuts and a branch that's for the innovation nuts, and kind of give people more than one framework in which to operate. I would support that.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you can just say, if you had, a big red label on certain products, not approved by FDA for this, but, approved by the private consortium or whatever it is, then, and by the way, remember, you always have the issue of doctors and whether they prescribe stuff, because a lot of the stuff that's approved, that's certified, is not used for the reason it's certified, right? Aspirin had been used for years and years for heart issues, and it was not certified for that. And so you do have these other mechanisms already in place to do that sort of thing. And if you just had it made it official and say, look, you can have products that are certified at this level, and there's a big red label saying, not approved by FDA for, in this way. That's why, again, I like to go back to the parallel track example.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. So it's interesting to consider, as Willy pointed out, that sometimes the advocacy of certain other entities can broaden the Overton window, so to speak. And if people, let's say within more of the mainstream of either the regulatory agency or reformist politicians want to make a certain change, they can point to the more extreme advocates and they can say, well, these people want to go that far. We don't quite want to go that far. We just want a little bit of moderate, sensible, incremental reform, which is probably what most people would have wanted all along. But this is a tactic to get to that point. Jason Geringer in our internal chat says, quote, I would like to see some representatives from the Green Party and the Libertarian Party here involved in this conversation and see if this could be an issue that the three parties can find consensus on. I'm also thinking perhaps the Libertarian Party could be that kind of organization to essentially push that Overton window in the direction of, let's say, more openness to innovation. And they could say, abolish the FDA. We could say, well, here are all of these sensible incremental reforms that won't quite abolish the FDA, although perhaps in the long term, the outcome will be quite similar to what the libertarians want anyway. So what are everyone's thoughts about that from a tactical and strategic standpoint?
Yes, I have to say yes, because that does actually work. I mean, we've seen this on the left for a long time. We've seen radical communists promoting radical communist agendas, and then other people on the, well, I hate the terms right and left because they're stupid terms from the French parliament. It doesn't make any sense these days, but what can we do right now? Okay, so you know what I mean. The socialistic types, they can point to the wild and crazy communists and say, well, we don't want to do that. We just want to, put the government in more control of these things. And it does work because it stretches, as you say, the Overton window, it opens that window, it stretches the boundaries of discourse, and it allows people to position themselves as the moderates. So I think that can work in this case. And this is not just theoretical on my part. I grew up in Margaret Thatcher's England. I was born in 1964. I was a teenager when Thatcher was there. She actually, I'm not going to praise Thatcher because there's a big mixture there, but she did a lot of good economically and kind of shocked things into a more vibrant system. And one reason she could do that was because there was these wild and crazy libertarians. There was the Institute for Economic Affairs. There were all these groups, the Adam Smith Institute, pushing pretty radical market ideas. And she could say, well, we're not going to go that far, but there's some sense in these ideas. We're going to be the moderates here. So on the one hand, yes, you don't want to identify with the particular group that maybe is right on the far edge, even if they might actually be right, possibly, but maybe they're not. But it helps to have that because then you can present yourself as the moderate, and quite reasonably so. So I think we should remember that factor. It does actually work in the real world.
Well, as somebody who's been involved, I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party, but of course I know a lot of their people, and over the years. And one of my concerns, by the way, is that right now they really don't have a big voice in American politics. In fact, I have a whole chapter in my book on the Libertarian Party where I say, I know most of the people and so forth, and they've gotten to the point where they don't have a big influence after 50 years. And so, whether you like that or not, I'm just pointing out, I hope someday maybe they will, but they just haven't been as effective in recent times as they might have been. But I do agree, by the way, that I was one of the people who in the mid 1990s was saying, do we really need an FDA? And now I consider myself a practical, I don't want to label myself, whether you label me a libertarian or I don't care what you label me, but I still see, if you really want to change things, yeah, it's nice for people to push the boundaries, because I did it 25 years ago. But I find that when I sit down with some influencers or people on Capitol Hill or people who may not have any political views one way or the other, but just say, how can we deal with Alzheimer's? Then I can say, well, here are some ways that are politically doable, and that it can actually work, and it can make things better, and it moves things in the right direction. And I'm willing to push as far as I can, but I want to actually get things done, because the fact that I was writing about this 25 years ago and we haven't progressed as much as we can indicates that we really should kind of try to focus on what works, what moves us along. And I'm happy to go as far as we can.
Ed, have you heard of Madsen Perry?
Oh, I knew Madsen Perry, yeah.
Well, he's a pretty good strategist, right? He's been around for a long time. And as far as I know, his views are pretty hardcore, but that's not the way he comes on when he's talking to MPs and politicians.
Yes.
He comes on with talk about how can we buy out the bureaucracy? How can we create incentives to make these changes? He's very pragmatic.
Yes.
So I don't think we're on a different wavelength. I do just want to say, though, you mentioned the Libertarian Party. I'm not a Libertarian Party person. I never have been. I actually dislike the idea of a Libertarian Party. So when I'm talking about libertarian views, I'm talking about policy institutes and thinking, not party stuff at all. I don't want to be a party.
No, that's fine. I work for the Cato Institute, which is considered libertarian, but libertarian, of course, means very, very socially liberal. And Madsen, that's a good model, by the way, because Madsen Perry was just, very, very reasonable. And by the way, he was also a very good amateur astronomer, so keep that in mind too.
And he wears a lot of bow ties.
And he wears a lot of bow ties, right? Okay. So.
Yes, excellent. So we have a question that I think should be addressed precisely because addressing it effectively could alleviate a lot of the skepticism about FDA reform or more rapid authorization of vaccines, especially. David Wood asks, isn't there another kind of error besides the type 1 and type 2 errors that have been discussed? And this error, in his view, is that if the FDA approves use of vaccines ahead of efficacy being established, and people take vaccines with low efficacy, they will fail to be protected from infection. And later on in the chat, Didier Kernel also raised a similar concern, which I think is one of the main reasons for pushback against more rapid approval of vaccines. I think those of us in this discussion would have supported a much earlier approval of any of the COVID-19 vaccines. So how would we respond to that particular concern?
Yeah, so there's two responses to that. The first is that actually it's not true that we had no clue what the efficacy was going to be prior to the phase 3, because in the phase 2, they studied the immunogenicity and they looked at the antibody responses. They had also done challenge trials on chimpanzees, and they had shown that the vaccines were effective. So, of course, chimpanzee trials don't always translate to human trials, but they often do. So, in the sense of Bayesian thinking, we had strong evidence statistic type that the vaccines are going to be effective. That's the first point. The second point is that even if we didn't know that the vaccines were going to be, whether they were going to be effective or not, I would still argue that the best thing to do would be to make them available, because you can learn a lot faster through an observational study on a large number of people than through an RCT. It's very hard to get people to enroll in an RCT, partly because some of the people get a placebo and therefore they're not getting the vaccine. And they also have to commit to like 2 years of study. And it's just very hard to get people into RCTs. But it's very easy to get lots of people to take the vaccine if you make it available. And then it's very simple to have those do checkup, call those people and check in with them, or maybe have some more formalized system where you observe them. And then you can learn actually faster whether the vaccine was effective or not. So yeah, there is a concern that some people, that you could get an ineffective vaccine, that, and then people would change their behavior. Thinking that they're protected, but they're actually not protected. That is a legitimate concern. However, we're dealing with trade-offs here, and I just think that in the balance, the argument is much stronger for letting people have the vaccine, at least after like a basic phase 1 safety trial.
I could just jump in and say a few remarks too. So one of the things we discussed was the delay in vaccine approval from October to November. So, that would have given us, when Eric Topol pushed for the delay of approval by like 6 weeks, that gave the FDA a longer follow-up period. So there was like maybe 2 months of follow-up data on participants instead of like a month or something like that. I don't remember the details, but the efficacy readout would still have occurred if we had done it a month earlier, just with like slightly fewer participants. So the estimate would have been a little less precise. And what we wouldn't have known was theoretical side effects that would occur at 2 months instead of 1 month. There's theoretical reasons to think that, when vaccines do cause problems, which they have in the past occasionally, it's because of contamination, because of bad manufacturing, or like short-term, acute side effects like, antibody-dependent enhancement, which makes the disease worse, which is rare. It's only happened in one vaccine, or happens in two diseases. Those vaccines are not on the market anymore, but it's pretty rare. So, the theoretical reasons that Eric Topol had to delay approval, were not good. And in terms of just the pretest probability of vaccines working, I think an argument that I tried to make on Twitter at some point, in like May of last year, but I never really articulated in a well thought out form, is that relative to other drugs, vaccines, in my opinion, have a higher pretest probability of working, and we also have pretty good surrogate endpoints compared to other drugs. So like, there's probably like 36 or so vaccines that are approved for human use. So, they're pretty well understood technology. Yes, there have been some diseases where vaccines have failed to work, like HIV and malaria, but those are not the rule. So your default assumption for a new pathogen should probably be, we have a pretty good chance of developing a vaccine. So if you think of the FDA decision as basically saying, we're going to get all this information to shift what our probability that the drug works, if the pretest probability for the drug working is already pretty high, as it should be compared to other drugs, because again, there's so many vaccines that have worked in the past, then you probably do need a lower amount of evidence. You should be more willing to experiment. That was an argument I tried to make. I didn't see other people articulating that, but yeah.
Two other points. First of all, I misspoke actually. It was not a chimpanzee challenge trial. It was macaque monkeys. So I think Moderna did a challenge trial with mice. They showed the vaccine worked. And then I think it was AstraZeneca that did a challenge trial with macaque monkeys. So I just wanted to correct that. And then also, basically scientists knew that this vaccine was going to work just from, like you were saying, experience with previous vaccines. They knew that we sort of got lucky and that this virus was relatively easy to develop a vaccine for. So it wasn't like HIV or something where the the outer coat changes and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, we had strong reason to believe it was going to work even before the phase 3 trials.
Yes, indeed. And I would also echo those responses. It's important to note we're not starting out in a complete scientific vacuum when a new vaccine is being developed. We have essentially over 2 centuries of general knowledge about vaccination and about bacteria and viruses. Of course, vaccinations are useful against viruses, but how diseases spread and what is not effective. And then the second point that I would like to make is when a vaccine is not entirely effective, some vaccines are more effective than others, that does become known empirically. So over time, if a vaccine is only partially effective, the statistics on infections are going to bear that out. And it's still better than nothing, by the way. But if a vaccine is not completely effective, so people will discover that in a little bit of time, and research will continue on potentially more effective vaccines. I just don't see the kind of drawback that people are concerned about. The seasonal flu vaccines are often less than 50% effective. They're considered very good vaccines if they're more than 50% effective. So is that a reason not to approve them? I don't think so.
Just to throw another point into this, there's a bioethicist, Julian Savulescu, who pointed out, even if you have a vaccine that's only 10% effective, if you give that to the elderly during the pandemic, that would save a lot of lives. So that's just another
Absolutely.
thing.
Yeah. Similarly, in testing, Paul Romer published a visualization in March of 2020 that I retweeted, showing that even a test that was wrong 80% of the time would be way better than nothing. And obviously, the tests that were available but illegal at the time were much more accurate than that.
Mm-hmm. And there was also an interesting discussion in our internal chat. Jason Geringer asked, does federal law always override state law? Could a state make a law for some kind of innovation zone where reforms such as the kinds that have been proposed here could take place on a state or local level? Jim responded, not super cleanly, but compare states legalizing marijuana despite a federal ban. So technically speaking, per the US Constitution, federal law does override state law, but sometimes de facto, states have been able to put in place measures that aren't exactly in accord with federal law. Any comments on this?
Yeah, a closer analogy would be the right to try laws that several other speakers have said states started passing 10 years ago. However, an important part of the story is that even after a majority of states had passed right to try laws, most pharma companies were afraid to participate in them because they feared punitive action by FDA. So that's an issue worth considering. It would be cleaner if Congress would pass a law saying we are allowing some innovation zones with the full protection of official federal law, and in these innovation zones, a lighter regulatory regime would apply.
Yeah. Jim's right on the mark on that one. That's one of the problems is right to try was well-meaning. It was essentially the state saying, hey, we're going to do this anyway. Congress eventually said, yeah, it's okay if you do that, but you're right. A lot of the manufacturers have been very reluctant to offer their not certified products, and for the exact reason that Jim said, and that's why right to try just hasn't been used very often.
So David Wood has followed up on some of his observations. He asks, but if you give someone a vaccine that is only 10% effective, should you be looking to give them another vaccine as soon as possible to provide extra coverage? Now, personally, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. So if I had gotten a vaccine that was 10% effective, maybe it will work, but in 90% of people, it doesn't work. And then a few months later, another more effective vaccine was developed. I'll be happy to take the 10% protection for now and then come in a few months to get another shot. As long as there are no adverse interactions expected, I would not have any problems with that. Do you think that's an issue at all? Anyone on the panel? It doesn't look like that is a scenario that gives rise to concerns. I really think anything is better than nothing from the standpoint of getting at least some preliminary protection.
Well, yeah, I do think it's a concern a bit. And I think David Wood has pointed out previously in other discussions that I think one of the drug companies actually developed a COVID or SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that didn't work. I think it was Merck, but I'm not 100% sure. And I think if you look statistically, the failure rate for vaccines is something like 20% overall. I don't remember exactly, but it's non-negligible. So it is a concern. But like I said before, I just think that when you weigh everything out, and especially given the evidence we had from the animal trials and the immunogenicity trials, we should have made it available before the phase 3.
Yes. So I think before we have any concluding remarks, I would like to ask one more question. And this was motivated by an observation that John H. in the YouTube chat had brought up. He pointed out that the European Union blocks GMOs. And so in many respects, European regulatory agencies are actually more restrictive than the FDA in ways that we would consider irrational or unscientific. Jose pointed out that the European Medicines Agency can be in some ways more of an obstacle to the approval of new drugs and treatments than the US FDA. Another recent example was how various European governments, this was even against the advice of the European Medicines Agency, suddenly pulled the approval of the AstraZeneca vaccine because of blood clots that were actually statistically less prevalent than in the general population. It just so happened that a few people shortly after getting vaccinated got these blood clots. So there is a way that despite all of the undue stringency that we have been discussing, in some respects, the US FDA actually is a bit more reasonable than its counterparts in Europe. And we're seeing now with the vaccination progress, despite the disastrous policy decisions that were made throughout 2020, somehow the US is ahead of most of the world, with the exception of the few countries that were mentioned, like Israel and the Seychelles and the United Arab Emirates. So how do you think it becomes possible in these times of crisis, despite misstep after misstep, for the US to still be ahead on net after the passage of time? What are the advantages playing in the United States' favor that perhaps we should not disregard because we want to preserve those advantages in the aftermath of any reform effort?
Well, just real quickly, Alex Tabarrok has spoken about this, and what he credits the US for doing right is just investing a lot of money into the vaccine development. And the other point, I guess, is I sort of disagree a little bit with what you said, because the at least in Europe, they have the AstraZeneca vaccine. Here, we still don't even have the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think that's a huge huge failing.
Yes, I agree that the failure to approve the AstraZeneca vaccine has been a massive blunder. Jim, do you have any thoughts on this question of why the US was suddenly ahead despite all of the mistakes?
Yeah, I agree with what Dan said. The Operation Warp Speed sped up vaccine approvals or development a lot, despite the extremely slow approvals. I would also say we have more drug and vaccine companies in the US than any other country has. And that helped when it came to just getting the supplies. But I would say, overall comparison with other countries is not as relevant as comparison with what we easily could have achieved if we had better regulation.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. And my hope is that as a consequence of this panel, more people will be thinking about promising avenues for regulatory reform and removing some of these barriers that have tragically cost hundreds of thousands of lives during this pandemic. And of course, millions of other lives due to missed opportunities for approving and in some cases, even developing life-saving, life-extending medicines. So with that, I would invite any of the panelists to offer their final comments as we wind down this discussion. Are there any additional remarks that you think it would be important for our viewers to hear? Edward, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an excellent discussion. And what I hope is that the errors that have been made during the pandemic offer us an opportunity to make the wider case for the sort of reforms that we want. Because we, as transhumanists, as futurists, and so forth, understand what is possible. For those of us who've read since Jose, like to hold up the transhumanist reader. This, of course, with especially the notion of the Fractionary Principle, really provides a guide to how to think about things. One of my favorites, of course, is Aubrey de Grey's book. And let's keep in mind that this is the broader context of this discussion. Yes, we want to make sure that in the future, pandemics are dealt with quicker and so forth. But what we're really looking at in the future is also these other reforms that, so hopefully 10 years from now, we can talk about the great breakthrough in Alzheimer's. We can talk about the great breakthroughs in gene therapy that have extended life. We can talk about wearable diagnostics and genetic sequencing and real world data and all these other great things. So just keep that in mind, the broader vision. And again, let us be practical. Let us be like Madsen Peary. Let us basically say this isn't Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, whatever. And that's the long term. And I think that's the value of this, is it really gets us to thinking about how can we do this moving ahead. And thank you very much for putting this on. This is excellent.
Yes, thank you. Max, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just put something in the chat. It occurred to me we've had such a great discussion, very productive. We're not all agreeing on everything, which is great. And we've, I think, have very different intelligent perspectives. It would be fantastic if someone could maybe take charge of putting together a summary of the issues we discussed and different perspectives, letting each person who's been speaking edit that to make sure that views get across clearly. I think presenting this, I think, get it distributed to a wider audience would show that there are some very different perspectives that haven't really been well communicated in general. And not that we're all robotically agreeing on everything, because we're certainly not, but would expand people's thinking quite a bit. So I don't know if someone was willing to take on that kind of job, but I'd certainly be willing to assist with it. And if other people like the idea, maybe we can consider doing that.
Yes, I completely agree. It would be a great idea, for instance, for a Google document to be put together and made accessible to each of the panelists to input their ideas or edit a summary that someone else puts together. So thank you for that suggestion. And yes, anybody who has notes already, please submit them to Dan, Elton, and myself, and we will get that started. So now, Jim, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, So we have a great opportunity here. The problems with FDA are much more apparent to regular people than they ever have been because of the multiple failures on COVID. And so while that's a tragedy, it's also an opportunity to lay down the facts and the problems and the solutions while people have this fresh in mind and we have their attention. It's not a Republican versus Democrat issue. In fact, if you go back to last September and October, reporters frequently asked the Biden campaign what they would do differently than the Trump administration was, and they didn't really have a very different answer. It's not a left versus right issue. It's a burden of proof problem that almost everyone across the spectrum could understand. And so we need to work on that. On aging, I would say, as I said before, the reforms at FDA that would help aging are the same reforms we've been talking about that would help everything. However, it would be great to create an Office of Geroscience at NIH. I've been working on that. And if anyone wants to work with me on that, please reach out.
Wonderful. So now let us go to Willy for his concluding thoughts.
I thought it was a great panel. Thank you for including me. And I hope that something productive comes out of this. I think a few of the panelists were maybe hinting that they're working with, people on regulatory reform and proposals to some people. So, if there's any way it can be useful to that effort, I love reading. I like to write. So, I'd love to be involved. And yeah, thank you for putting this together, Dan and Gennady.
Yes, thank you, Willy. And Dan, do you have any concluding thoughts?
I don't have a lot to say at this point. I think this was a extremely useful discussion and one of the most information dense events that we put on. And I love how everyone contributed something to the discussion. And there were some interesting differences as far as strategy and as far as which reforms would be the best to pursue. So I thought that was very interesting.
Hey Dan, as part of a kind of a summary with input from all the speakers, I'm wondering if maybe your Google Doc listing the various possible reforms, you might expand that based on anything that's been said here when someone puts all this together. And then would people think it would be a good idea to maybe have each of the speakers do a rank ordering of what they thought the most promising interventions were, so we kind of have a group summary of what we think is most effective or plausible? Just a thought anyway.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of got that a little bit in the discussion, but it'd be nice. It might be nice to see it a little more formalized, and actually would be very interesting to publish. Yeah, it's a good, interesting idea.
And Dan, we can talk offline about this because I always think of who's going to be the audience if we pull something together, and I'm always looking at how you can leverage it. So we can talk offline about how to do that.
Yes, wonderful. I think this could be quite a promising synthesis of the different ideas that have been proposed. And Didier Kernel in the chat indicated as well, it would be great indeed to have a synthesis of all arguments and ideas to improve the work of the FDA, ultimately for radical healthy life extension. So thank you very much to all of our panelists and all of the guests for a most insightful and enriching discussion. Indeed, I hope that more fruitful ideas and syntheses come from this, and that the public pays attention, because I do think people need to be outraged about the death toll of this pandemic, but they also need to be very rational and level-headed about how to fix these problems so that we do not experience these kinds of tragedies again, and that the lessons from these events can be learned so as to dramatically extend human lifespans and cure many of the diseases afflicting people today. So this is the kind of discussion we encourage and seek to facilitate in our virtual Enlightenment Salons. Please continue tuning in every Sunday. Most Sundays, our virtual Enlightenment Salons are held at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time. And until then, live long, and prosper.